Chapter 1. The Comet's Curse. The sky over Mordheim was a sullen gray, the kind of color that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Above the city's jagged, blackened spires, the air hung thick with ash, a grim reminder of the comet that had obliterated the city 2 decades prior. Once a bustling hub of trade and wealth, Mordheim was now a corpse city, its streets choked with the detritus of the damned, its shattered temples given over to chaos and rot. It was said that Sigmar himself had turned his gaze away from this place. And who could blame him? The comet, blazing with eerie green fire, had been hailed as a divine omen, but when it struck, it became clear it was no blessing. The explosion shattered stone and flesh alike, and from its crater poured shards of unholy rock, wyrdstone. This strange, glowing mineral had properties that defied reason. It could turn the weakest pauper into a juggernaut of strength and cunning, but only at the cost of his soul. It promised wealth beyond measure, but it corroded those who dared touch it. Chaos worshippers, desperate peasants, and mercenaries from all corners of the empire descended upon Mordheim like vultures to a corpse. Wyrdstone became their god, and the ruined city their temple. But not everyone who ventured into Mordheim was a raving lunatic. Some were cold, calculating predators drawn by the promise of power. Among them were the Veiled Jackals. The Veiled Jackals weren't like the other scavengers who crawled over the ruins. They didn't come for petty riches or fleeting power. Led by Kellen Ruck, a man whose mind was as sharp as the dagger at his belt, the Jackals had turned Wyrdstone into a currency of control. They didn't seek to rule the chaos of Mordheim. They sought to export it. Rook stood atop a crumbling watchtower, his piercing gaze fixed on the horizon. His cloak, stitched together from scavenged leather and patched with wyrdstone threaded fabric, swayed in the cold wind. Below him the rest of the jackals moved like shadows, picking through the ruins of an old marketplace. Rook's presence was commanding, but it wasn't just his charisma that bound the jackals to him. There was something unsettling about the man, a calculating coldness that made even his closest allies tread carefully. "Anything promising?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with authority. Risa Greel, the jackal's alchemist, emerged from a pile of rubble, holding a shard of wyrdstone in her gloved hand. Its glow reflected in her pale eyes as she turned it over, studying the jagged edges. "Crude but viable," she said, tossing it into a reinforced satchel at her hip. "It'll do for refining." Rook nodded, satisfied. It was Risa who had cracked the Wyrdstone's mysteries, or at least enough of them to make the jackals untouchable in the trade. Most who handled Wyrdstone for too long became disfigured, corrupted, or worse, but Risa had discovered a way to stabilize it, distilling the raw shards into crystalline forms they called reflection. Unlike raw wyrdstone, reflections didn't twist the body immediately. Instead, they targeted the mind, altering perception and amplifying emotions. Those exposed to it would feel empowered, euphoric, and compliant, pliant tools in the hands of those who wielded the shards. It was a weapon unlike any other, one that allowed the jackals to manipulate merchants, mercenaries, and even petty nobles in the surrounding regions. Down below, Dag Kranth, Rook's enforcer, was busy inspecting the remains of a smashed wagon. His massive frame was draped in scavenged chainmail, and his face bore the scars of countless battles. He pulled a crate from the wreckage, pried it open, and grinned. Inside was a collection of green shards, their glow faint but unmistakable. "Looks like someone's stash," he said, hoisting the crate over one shoulder. "What poor fool left this lying around?" "Someone who's probably watching us right now," Lasklorn replied, his voice a low murmur. The thief of the group, Lask had a knack for finding danger before it found them. He scanned the shadows with a dagger in hand, his wiry frame tense like a coiled spring. Rook raised a hand, silencing the group. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the ruins. The air seemed heavier now, filled with the weight of unseen eyes. Mordheim had a way of creeping up on even the most seasoned survivor. "Keep moving," Rook ordered. "We're not here to make enemies today." "Today?" Lask muttered, falling in line. As the Jackals made their way back to their hideout, Rook's mind turned to the road ahead. Mordheim was a gold mine, but it was also a trap. The wyrdstone trade had made them powerful, but power always drew attention. The Jackals weren't the only predators in the ruins. Rival warbands, mercenary companies, and even chaos cults prowled the city, hunting for wyrdstone and blood in equal measure. As Chaos Legion deployment waxed whiner, and then there were the witch hunters. Rook's lips curled into a thin smile as he thought of them. Fanatical, dogmatic fools, scouring the land for signs of heresy. They were a problem, to be sure, but they were also predictable. Rook knew how to outmaneuver them, so long as his own people didn't falter. He glanced at Risa, who was busy cataloging the haul, and Dag, who carried the crate like it weighed nothing. They were loyal, for now, but wyrdstone had a way of eroding loyalty, just as surely as it eroded flesh. Still, Rook wasn't worried. The Jackals were his, and so long as he had the reflections, they would remain so. As the ruined city of Mordheim loomed behind them, its shattered walls glowing faintly in the green light of wyrdstone, Rook allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The game was dangerous, yes, but it was one he knew how to play, and he intended to win. Chapter 2. The Veiled Jackals. The hideout of the Veiled Jackals was little more than a gutted watchtower perched on the outskirts of Mordheim. Its crumbling walls were draped with patchwork tarps, and the faint green glow of wyrdstone crystals illuminated its shadowy interior. It wasn't much, but it served its purpose, a place to regroup, plan, and store their carefully hoarded cache of wyrdstone. Inside, the warband moved like pieces on a chessboard, each one filling a specific role in Kellenruck's grand design. To outsiders, they were a collection of scavengers, no different from any other band of fortune-seekers in Mordheim. But to those who had seen them in action, the Veiled Jackals were far more than that. They were sharp, methodical, and, most importantly, bound together by the quiet, calculating brilliance of their leader. Kellenruck. Kellenruck sat at a makeshift desk fashioned from the splintered remains of a cargo crate, examining a crudely drawn map of the city and its surrounding trade routes. His fingers drummed lightly on the table as he worked through the pieces of his latest scheme. His face, sharp and angular, bore the scars of a life spent fighting battles not just with swords, but with wits. Rook wasn't like the other warband leaders in Mordheim. Where others relied on brute force or blind devotion, Rook wielded strategy. He could read people as easily as he could read a map, finding their weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating. His power came from his presence, the way his eyes seemed to see right through someone. Even his own followers tread carefully around him, knowing that Rook's loyalty was never unconditional. "Dog," he called, his voice calm but commanding. "You've been sharpening that sword for an hour. Find something useful to do." From the corner of the room, Dag Kranth looked up, his brow furrowing as he set aside his blade. Rook returned his attention to the map without another word, trusting the man to obey. He always did. Dag Kranth was a hulking man, all muscle and scars, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Where Rook's power lay in his intellect, Dag's lay in his raw physicality. He was the warband's enforcer, a battering ram in human form. Dag had once been a pit fighter, carving a brutal reputation in the blood-soaked arenas of Stirland. It was there that Rook had found him, half dead after a particularly savage fight. Rook had seen something in the man, not just strength, but a deep, unshakable loyalty. For Dag, Rook was more than a leader. He was a savior. The man had plucked him from the edge of death and given him a purpose. That faith had grown into something almost fanatical. Dag would do anything for Rook, kill, maim, or die without a moment's hesitation. He stood near the entrance, sharpening his blade with a whetstone. His movements were slow and deliberate, but there was a coiled tension in him, like a predator waiting for the hunt. "You need me to crush anyone?" he asked, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not yet," Rock replied without looking up. "But stay ready." Risa Grill moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of a scholar. Her dark eyes scanned the contents of a small alchemical workstation she had assembled in one corner, where glass vials and crude burners jostled for space. A faint green glow emanated from the wyrdstone shards she handled with gloved hands. Risa was the band's alchemist, the one who had turned wyrdstone from a chaotic, dangerous resource into a tool of control. She had discovered how to refine it into reflections, distilling its raw power into a crystalline form that bent the minds of those who came into contact with it. Her past was a mystery, even to the rest of the Jackals. She spoke little of where she came from or how she had learned her craft, but her knowledge was undeniable. The others respected her skill, though they kept their distance. Risa's experiments had a way of unsettling people, especially when they went wrong. "Careful with that," Rook said as she poured a bubbling green liquid into a vial. Risa glanced at him, arching a brow. "I always am." "Good," Rook said, "'cause we'll need a fresh batch ready by tomorrow. We've got a shipment to move." She nodded, her expression unreadable. Risa was loyal, but Rook knew her loyalty came from necessity, not faith. She stayed because she needed the resources and protection the warband provided. Rook kept her close, knowing she was as much a danger as an asset. Laskaya Lask, Lorne. Lask Lorne lounged on a stack of crates near the back of the room, flipping a small dagger between his fingers. He had the wiry build of a thief and the easy charm of a rogue who knew how to talk his way out of trouble. Lask was the warband smuggler, the one who ensured their wyrdstone reached the markets outside Mordheim. He had a network of contacts that stretched from Stirland to Averland, and he knew how to slip past patrols and rival warbands with practiced ease. "You keep pushing these shipments farther out," he said, his voice laced with mock irritation. "I'm starting to think you want me caught." "Then maybe you should get faster," Ruck replied without looking up. Lask grinned. "Fair enough." Though he played the part of the carefree rogue, Lask was no fool. He knew the risks of smuggling wyrdstone, especially reflections. If the witch hunters caught wind of what he was moving, they wouldn't just burn him at the stake, they'd make it last. But the rewards were worth the risk. The Jackals paid him well, and Lask knew he was good at what he did. He was loyal, at least for now, though his loyalty was as flexible as his moral compass. The band's motivation. The Veiled Jackals were united by a singular goal: escape. Mordheim was a death trap, a rotting carcass that devoured anyone foolish enough to linger too long. But the wyrdstone trade was their ticket out. Rook had promised them a way out of the chaos, a way to amass enough wealth and power to carve out a life far from Mordheim's shadow. For Dag, it was a chance to serve a leader he believed in. For Risa, it was access to resources and freedom for her experiments. For Lask, it was gold and the thrill of the game. As long as Rook held their leash, they would follow him, but Mordheim had a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and as the band's power grew, so too would the threats against them. For now, the Jackals were united, their goals aligned. But in Mordheim, alliances could shatter as easily as wyrdstone shards, and Rook knew better than anyone that trust was a rare commodity. The game was just beginning. Chapter 3. Shards of Influence. The small chamber was filled with an eerie green glow emanating from rows of crystalline shards laid carefully on a table. The Veiled Jackals stood gathered around, watching as Risa Grill worked her craft. Glass vials bubbled over a crude alchemical burner, filling the air with acrid smoke. The clinking sound of a mortar and pestle punctuated the tense silence as Risa ground a shard of wyrdstone into a fine, glittering powder. "Perfect," she murmured, holding the finished product up to the light. The powder shimmered like crushed emeralds, mesmerizing and dangerous. Is it ready? Kellenrook asked, his voice calm but expectant. Ready enough, Risa replied. She scooped a pinch of the powder into a small vial and handed it to Rook. Just remember, this isn't something to play with. Too much, and you'll wish you hadn't. Rook examined the vial, turning it in his hand. The crystalline powder inside seemed to swirl on its own like a living thing. It was a thing of beauty, and like most beautiful things in Mordheim, it was deadly. The power of reflections. Reflections, Risa had called them, though the name barely did justice to the substance's effects. These refined shards of wyrdstone were far more than just a drug or a tool. They were a weapon, a way to bend the will of anyone foolish enough to use them. Reflections came in many forms. The crystalline shards could be inhaled, their vapor filling the lungs with a heady rush of euphoria and insight. When ground into powder, they could be ingested or even dissolved into liquid, creating a subtle but potent brew that amplified strength, dulled fear, and heightened perception. But the power came at a cost. Reflections corrupted the soul, leaving the user vulnerable to paranoia, delusion, and worse. Over time, those who relied on the substance too heavily became hollow shells of their former selves, consumed by greed and desperation. Rook, of course, saw only opportunity. With reflections, the Jackals could control not just the flow of wyrdstone, but the people who traded in it, turning puppets into profits. The Jackals' latest target was a merchant caravan bound for Averland. It was a lucrative route, one that passed close enough to Mordheim to make smuggling feasible, but far enough to avoid most patrols. The caravan's master, a rotund man named Borlek, had been easy enough to manipulate. Lask Lorne had slipped a small dose of reflections into his wine during a meeting at a nearby way station. By the end of the night, Borlek had been singing the Jackals' praises, eager to do business with them. Now, as the caravan prepared to leave, Borlek stood in a daze, his eyes glazed and his hands trembling. The faint green shimmer of reflections lingered in his pupils, a telltale sign of his newfound devotion to Rook and his warband. "You'll take the shipment as planned," Rook said, his voice low and measured. He stood before Borlek, the vial of reflections in his hand. "Once you reach Averheim, you'll sell the goods to the contact we've arranged. No deviations, no question." Borlek nodded quickly, sweat beading on his brow. "Yes, of course. Anything you say." "Bell?" "And if anyone asks," Rook continued, "you'll tell them it's a shipment of Averland silks, nothing more. Do you understand?" "Perfectly," Borlek stammered. Rook smiled, satisfied. "Good. Then we'll see you on your return journey." As Borlek stumbled back to his caravan, Lask stepped forward, a sly grin on his face. "You sure he's not going to crack?" the thief asked. "He won't," Ruck replied. "Not yet. The reflections will keep him loyal long enough to make the delivery. After that, well, he won't be our problem anymore." Lask chuckled. "Cold, even for you." "Cold keeps us alive," Rook said simply. "The network expands." The Jackals' use of reflections wasn't limited to one caravan. Over the past few months, they had carefully expanded their influence, targeting key figures in the trade routes surrounding Mordheim. Caravan masters, dock workers, and even low-ranking customs officials had all fallen under the sway of the crystalline shards. Some were willing participants, eager to taste the power that reflections offered. Others had been manipulated, like Borlek, their minds bent to Ruck's will, without their knowledge. Through this network of unwitting puppets, the Jackals had gained control over the flow of wyrdstone into Stirland, Averland, and beyond. Their profits were growing, and with each successful shipment, their power grew as well. But Rook knew better than to grow complacent. The witch hunters were never far behind, and every shard of wyrdstone they smuggled brought them closer to the edge of discovery. A dangerous gamble. That night, as the Jackals gathered around a small fire in their hideout, Rook addressed the group. The glow of the firelight mixed with the green shimmer of the wyrdstone, casting strange shadows on the walls. "We're making progress," Rook said, his voice calm but firm. "The caravans are moving, the network is expanding, and the profits are growing, but we can't afford to slip. Every shipment we move brings us closer to our goal, and closer to being discovered." Dagkrant nodded, his massive frame looming in the firelight. "If anyone comes for us, they won't leave alive." Risa Greel leaned back against the wall, her expression unreadable. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The witch hunters aren't known for their mercy." "They won't find us," Lass said with a grin. "Not unless we let them." Rook looked around at his warband, his sharp eyes catching each of them in turn. "Good. Then let's keep it that way. We've got the tools, we've got the plan, and we've got the will. Now we just need to see it through." As the fire crackled and the shadows danced, the jackals prepared for their next move. They were playing a dangerous game, but so far the odds were in their favor. For now. Chapter 4. The Expanding Web. The roads winding out of Mordheim were arteries of opportunity and danger. Every route was a gamble, with bandits, rival warbands, and the ever-watchful witch hunters patrolling the land. For the Veiled Jackals, however, the chaos was their playground. The more unpredictable the roads became, the easier it was for them to operate. Their influence was spreading like a silent plague, seeping into the trade routes of Stirland and Averland. Seeds of chaos. Caravans that once carried mundane goods, grain, wool, and salted meats, now smuggled wyrdstone shards disguised as precious metals or exotic trinkets. Dockmasters and customs officials, many of them unwitting pawns under the influence of reflections, ensured that shipments passed through without inspection. Key merchants, enthralled by the Jackals' coffers, funneled profits directly into the Jackals' coffers. The Jackals' growing influence wasn't just a matter of wealth. The subtle effects of wyrdstone began to ripple through the economy. Once reliable traders suddenly made erratic decisions. Prices of goods fluctuated wildly, destabilizing local markets. Rival caravans found themselves undercut or ambushed by mysteriously well-informed bandits. In Stirland, whispers of strange behavior among merchants reached the ears of wary nobles. In Averland, several caravan masters who had grown too dependent on reflections vanished under mysterious circumstances, their loyalty to the Jackals ensuring they took their secrets to the grave. But for all their careful planning, the Jackals were not invisible. The disturbances they caused were too great to go unnoticed, and they soon drew the attention of another force on the trade routes, the Black Talons. The Black Talons. The Black Talons were a mercenary company with a reputation for ruthlessness. Where the Jackals operated in the shadows, the Talons worked in plain sight, offering their services as guards for hire to merchants and nobles. They were led by Captain Garrick Var, a scarred veteran with a talent for sniffing out trouble. Var sat astride a massive black destrier as he surveyed a caravan that had been ambushed the night before. The wagon lay on its side, its goods scattered across the road. The bodies of the guards and drivers were still fresh, their throats slashed cleanly. "Third caravan this month," Var muttered, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. Standing beside him was his lieutenant, a wiry woman named Liera Gans. She crouched next to one of the bodies, inspecting the wounds. "This wasn't bandits," she said. "Too clean. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after." "Wyrdstone," Var growled. "It always comes back to wyrdstone." He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the faint green glow of Mordheim hung like a distant storm cloud. "The word is, there's a group working out of the ruins," Gans said. "They've been hitting caravans, destabilizing trade. People are starting to talk." Var narrowed his eyes. "The Veiled Jackals. I've heard the name before. They've been building something out there, something big, and now it's spilling onto my roads?" "What's the plan?" Gans asked. Var's expression hardened. "We sent a message. Track their next shipment and destroy it. Let them know the Talons don't tolerate competition. The ambush. The Jackals' latest shipment was making its way along a secluded route through the Stirland Hills, carried by a small caravan under the command of Lask Lorn. The wagons were laden with crates of refined wyrdstone, hidden beneath layers of mundane goods. Lask rode alongside the lead wagon, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Something felt off. The air was too still, the road too quiet. He tightened his grip on the reins, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. "Keep moving," he called to the drivers. "We're behind schedule as it is." The caravan rounded a bend in the road, where the hills rose steeply on either side. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. The first arrow struck the lead driver, burying itself in his chest. He slumped forward with a grunt, the reins slipping from his hands. "Ambush!" Lask shouted, drawing his dagger as chaos erupted around him. The black Talons descended from the hills like a pack of wolves, their black cloaks billowing behind them. They moved with precision, their archers picking off drivers while swordsmen closed in on the wagons. Lask leapt from his horse, rolling to avoid an arrow that whizzed past his head. He landed behind one of the wagons, drawing a second dagger from his belt. "Stay with the goods," he barked at the surviving drivers. The Talons hit hard and fast, but Lask was no stranger to a fight. He ducked under a sword swing, plunging his dagger into the attacker's side. Blood sprayed as the mercenary collapsed. But there were too many of them. "Rook's not going to like this," Lask muttered to himself as he slashed at another attacker. A costly retreat. By the time the dust settled, the Jackals had managed to escape with half the caravan intact. The rest of the goods, and most of the drivers, were lost. Lask and the surviving guards regrouped in a secluded glade, where they assessed the damage. 2 wagons gone, and most of the wyrdstone with them, one of the guards said grimly. Lask scowled, wiping blood from his blade. "Var's making his move. The Black Talons aren't just picking fights, they're sending a message." "What do we do now?" another guard asked. Lask sighed. "We regroup. Ruck's going to want to know about this, and we're going to need a plan, because this was just the first strike." Rook's response. Back at the Jackals' hideout, Kellen Rook listened intently as Lask recounted the ambush. His expression remained calm, but his eyes burned with cold fury. "They're testing us," Rook said once Lask had finished. "They want to see how we'll react. If we fold, they'll keep pushing until we're wiped out." "So what's the plan?" Datekrantz asked, his massive hands clenching into fists. "We hit back," Rook said. "Hard. But not yet. The Talons want a fight, so we give them one, but on our terms." Risa Grail stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with concern. "And what about the wyrdstone we lost? That's a lot of profit down the drain." "We'll make it back," Rook said. "Once the Talons are dealt with, we'll have free reign over the routes again." He turned to Lask. "Find out where they're operating from. I want to know everything. Numbers, locations, patrol patterns. If they want a war, we'll give them one." The Jackals nodded, their resolve hardening. The Black Talons had made their move, but Rook wasn't about to let anyone stand in the way of his plans. The game was escalating, and the Jackals were ready to play. Chapter 5. Blood on the Road. The morning mist clung to the hills like a shroud as the Veiled Jackals' caravan creaked its way down the winding trade road. 3 wagons trundled in single file, their drivers silent and tense. The air felt heavier than usual, a foreboding weight pressing down on the travelers. To the untrained eye, the wagons appeared to be carrying mundane goods, barrels of grain, bolts of coarse fabric. But hidden beneath the false cargo was their true payload, refined wyrdstone. Rook's orders had been clear. This shipment had to reach Averheim without delay. Their operation was already on shaky ground after the last ambush, and the loss of more wyrdstone would not just cost them profit, it would embolden their enemies. Lask Lorn rode at the head of the convoy, his sharp eyes scanning the foggy road ahead. Every crack of a branch and rustle of leaves made him tighten his grip on the reins. The Black Talons had been quiet since the last encounter, but Lask knew better than to mistake quiet for safety. "Keep your eyes open," he called back to the guards walking alongside the wagons. "They hit us once, they'll try again." The ambush. The attack came without warning. A sharp whistle pierced the mist, followed by the hiss of arrows. The first volley struck true, embedding themselves in the wood of the wagons and the flesh of the guards. One driver slumped forward, an arrow protruding from his neck, while another screamed as a shaft buried itself in his thigh. "Nation of the landscape!" Lask shouted, leaping from his horse and drawing his daggers. From the hills on either side of the road, the black Talons emerged. Clad in their signature black cloaks, they moved with brutal efficiency, their swords and axes glinting in the dim light. The Jackals scrambled to defend the wagons. Risa Greel crouched behind a stack of barrels, clutching a small pouch of wyrdstone powder. Her alchemical concoctions were dangerous and unpredictable, but they might be the only thing standing between them and certain death. Dag Kranth, the towering enforcer, let out a roar as he charged into the fray, swinging his two-handed hammer with devastating force. The weapon connected with a Talon's chest, shattering ribs and sending the man flying backward. His embarrassment in death. "They want our blood," Dag bellowed. "Come and get it." The battle turns. The clash of steel and the cries of the wounded filled the air as the Jackals fought to defend their precious cargo. Lask darted through the chaos like a shadow, his daggers flashing as he struck down one attacker after another. Risa hurled a small vial into the midst of the Talons, the glass shattering on impact. A thick green smoke erupted, filling the air with a pungent stench. The Talons, caught in the cloud, stumbled and coughed, their movements sluggish as the wyrdstone-infused fumes took hold. But the Talons were relentless. For every one they felled, another took their place. The Jackals were outnumbered, and the wagons were beginning to look like a lost cause. Lask cursed under his breath as he saw one of the wagons burst into flames, an overturned lantern igniting the fabric meant to hide the wyrdstone. The heat of the fire made the hidden shards glow with a sickly green light, and the scent of their corruption filled the air. "We're losing the payload," Lask shouted, barely dodging a sword swing aimed at his head. Dag's sacrifice. Dag Kranth fought like a man possessed, his hammer crashing through the Talons with reckless abandon. Blood spattered his face, and his eyes burned with fury, but even he couldn't hold them off forever. "Fall back to the second wagon," Lask yelled. Dag turned to see a group of Talons trying to unhook the second wagon's horses, intending to steal it outright. With a guttural roar, he charged forward, ignoring the arrows that thudded into his armor. He reached the wagon just as one of the Talons climbed onto the driver's seat. "No, you don't," Dag growled, swinging his hammer with both hands. The weapon connected with the man's side, sending him sprawling to the ground. But Dag's reckless charge left him exposed. A Talon archer took aim and loosed an arrow, the shaft striking Dag in the side. He staggered but didn't fall, swinging his hammer in a wide arc to drive back the attackers. "Get that wagon out of here," Dag shouted, his voice strained with pain. The aftermath. By the time the Black Talons retreated, the damage had been done. 2 wagons had been destroyed, their cargo lost to fire and theft. The remaining wagon, though battered, made it through with its precious wyrdstone intact. The surviving Jackals gathered in the aftermath, their faces grim. Lask knelt by Dag, who sat slumped against a boulder, his breathing labored. Blood seeped from the arrow wound in his side, staining the ground beneath him. "You a damn fool," Lask said, though there was a hint of admiration in his tone. Dag grinned weakly. "Better a fool than a coward." Rook arrived shortly after, his expression as cold as the morning air. He surveyed the scene with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in the losses without a hint of emotion. "We lost too much," he said finally. "This can't happen again." Lask stood, his daggers still dripping with blood. "They're onto us, Rook. The Talons know our routes. If we keep pushing without changing the game, they'll bleed us dry." Rook didn't respond immediately. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against a small vial of reflections. Lately, he had come to rely on the crystalline powder more and more. A small dose gave him clarity, focus, a way to keep the chaos of Mordheim at bay. But the more he used it, the more he felt its grip tightening around his mind. "They think they've won," Ruck said quietly, almost to himself. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "They think they can break us, but they don't know who they're dealing with." He turned to the others, his voice rising. "This isn't over. The Black Talons want to fight, then we'll give them one they'll never forget. We'll strike back, harder, faster. We'll remind them why no one crosses the Jackals." As the group prepared to move on, Rook felt the weight of the vial in his pocket. He knew the risks of relying on reflections, but the pull was irresistible. He was the leader of the Veiled Jackals, and if they were to survive, he needed every advantage he could get, even if it meant sacrificing a piece of himself. The road ahead was bloodied and uncertain, but one thing was clear: the war between the Jackals and the Black Talons was just beginning. Chapter 6. Whispers of Corruption. The Stirland chapter house of the witch hunters loomed like a grim fortress against the bleak landscape. Its jagged towers clawed at the overcast sky, casting long, foreboding shadows over the surrounding fields. A chill wind whispered through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint scent of burning incense and charred flesh. Within its walls, the fires of Sigmar's judgment burned ever brighter, fueled by the relentless zeal of its inhabitants. Inside, witch hunter Elias Vren stood before a large oak desk, its surface littered with parchment, maps, and wax-sealed letters. The room was dimly lit, save for the flickering glow of a brazier in the corner. Vren's piercing gray eyes scanned a report in his hand, his gauntleted fingers tightening around the parchment as he read. Madness. Paranoia. Sudden acts of violence, he murmured to himself, his voice low and sharp. Merchants turning on one another, caravan masters abandoning their routes, entire shipments vanishing without a trace. The account was one of many that had been delivered to the chapter house in recent weeks. Strange occurrences were spreading across Stirland and Averland, all of them tied to trade routes near Mordheim. At first, the reports had been dismissed as the usual dangers of traveling too close to the accursed city. But now there was a pattern, one that pointed to something far more sinister. Vren set the report down and turned to face his second-in-command, Captain Adalric Toth, a stern man clad in the dark leathers and silvered sigils of the witch hunters. "These incidents are no coincidence," Vren said. "Something, or someone, is spreading chaos along the trade routes, and I'll wager wyrdstone is at the heart of it." Toth nodded grimly. "The merchants won't admit it, but there are whispers of a warband operating out of Mordheim. They've been smuggling wyrdstone into Stirland for months, corrupting anyone foolish enough to deal with them." "Wyrdstone corruption spreads like a disease," Vren said, pacing the room. "It twists the mind, bends the will, and leaves chaos in its wake. If these reports are true, then every shard that makes its way into Stirland is another step toward damnation." Toth hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's more. Some of the merchants claim that this warband isn't just selling raw wyrdstone. They've found a way to refine it." Vren stopped pacing, his gaze snapping to Toth. "Refine it? How?" "They call it reflections. Crystalline shards that don't just corrupt, they ensnare. Those exposed to it become pliant, obsessed. It's said to grant insight, strength, even euphoria. But the price, well, you can imagine." Vren's jaw tightened. A warband manipulating the minds of merchants and caravan masters with this abomination? If even half of this is true, they've already destabilized the region. Toth stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's a name, sir. The Veiled Jackals. No one knows much about them, but they operate out of Mordheim, and they've grown bold. Too bold. The Zealot's mission." Vren turned back to the desk, his fingers tracing the hilt of his silvered longsword as he stared down at the map of the region. His face, pale and angular, was a mask of grim determination. "Sigmar's light cannot be allowed to wane in the face of this heresy," he said, his voice rising with righteous fervor. "If the Veiled Jackals are spreading corruption, then they must be purged. Every shard of wyrdstone, every accomplice, every wretch who has bent the knee to their schemes, all must burn." Toth saluted. "I'll ready the men." "No," Vren said, raising a hand. "Not yet. We cannot act blindly. I need to know more about these jackals, who leads them, how they operate, where they hide. Only then can we strike." He picked up the report again, his eyes scanning the list of recent disturbances. "Start with the merchants. Bring me anyone who's dealt with wyrdstone or even heard of this reflections. They'll talk, one way or another." Toth hesitated. "And if they don't?" Vren's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then we'll remind them what happens to those who harbor heretics. Interrogation and revelation." By nightfall, the witch hunters had rounded up a handful of suspects. Merchants, wagon drivers, and dock workers who had been seen lingering too close to Mordheim's shadow. They were dragged into the chapter house's dungeons, their protests drowned out by the clanking of iron shackles and the heavy tread of boots. Vren descended into the dungeon himself, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The cells were dimly lit, their occupants huddled in chains. Most of them looked terrified, their eyes darting nervously as Vren entered the room. The Inquisitor stopped in front of a wiry man with a crooked nose and trembling hands, a merchant, judging by his tattered robes. His face was pale, and his lips twitched as though he were on the verge of confessing everything. "You've dealt in wyrdstone," Vren said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Don't bother denying it. I can see the taint in your eyes." The man stammered, his words spilling out in a frantic rush. I don't know anything about the jackals, I swear. There was a man in Averheim, a caravan master. He offered me a chance to make a profit. Said he had something special. I didn't know." "What did he give you?" Vren demanded, stepping closer. The merchant swallowed hard. "Reflections, he called it reflections. Said it was wyrdstone, but different. He gave me a small vial to try. I only took a little, I swear." "And what did it do to you?" Vren pressed, his gaze unrelenting. The merchant shuddered, his hands trembling violently. "It was like seeing the world through new eyes. Everything was clearer, sharper. But then the nightmares started. Voices whispering, shadows moving where they shouldn't. I can't sleep anymore. I can't think. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't know what it was." Vren studied the man for a long moment before turning to Toth, who stood silently nearby. "He's been touched by chaos," Vren said coldly. "Burn him." The merchant screamed as the witch hunters dragged him from the cell, his pleas echoing down the stone corridor. Vren didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, and he knew the price of corruption. The hunt begins. By the next morning, Vren's course was set. The Veiled Jackals were no longer just rumors. They were a threat, one that could not be ignored. He donned his wide-brimmed hat and heavy coat, the sigil of Sigmar gleaming on his chest. "Oh," he said as he prepared to leave the chapter house. "Gather the men, we ride for Averland. If the jackals want to spread their poison, we'll cut them off at the root." "And Mordheim?" Todd asked. Vren's eyes narrowed. "We'll go there too, but first we strike where they're weakest. The caravans, the merchants, their little network of puppets. Burn it all, and the jackals will have nowhere to hide." As the witch hunters mounted their steeds and rode out, their torches casting flickering light against the gloom, the winds carried a new sound. The faint but unmistakable whispers of corruption, growing louder with each passing day. The hunt had begun. Chapter 7. The Refugees of Mordheim. The city of Mordheim rose like a cursed monument on the horizon, its jagged silhouette wreathed in the sickly green haze of wyrdstone corruption. For the Veiled Jackals, it was both a haven and a trap, a place where fortunes could be made or lives lost with a single misstep. Yet it was here they returned, driven by necessity and desperation. Their last few shipments had cost them dearly in men, supplies, and wyrdstone. They needed to regroup, resupply, and rebuild their strength. A gathering of the damned. The outskirts of Mordheim were as chaotic as the city itself. Ragged scavengers, mercenaries, and would-be warlords clustered around the ruins like vultures, eking out a grim existence on the edges of the cursed city. Tents and makeshift shelters dotted the landscape, forming a sprawling refugee camp where desperation was the only currency more abundant than wyrdstone. The Veiled Jackals entered the camp under the cover of dusk, their presence immediately drawing wary glances and whispered conversations. Kellen Rook led the way, his cloak pulled tightly around him. Beside him, Risa Greel carried a satchel of vials and tools, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. Dag Krant loomed behind them, his sheer size and the blood-stained hammer slung across his back, serving as a clear warning to anyone who might consider crossing them. Lask Lorn, ever the scout, drifted in and out of the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats or opportunities. "This place gets worse every time we come back," Lask muttered, stepping over a filthy beggar who clutched at his boot. "Didn't think that was possible." "It's Mordheim," Risa replied flatly. "There's no bottom to this pit." Rook ignored them, his attention focused on the crowd. This was where they would find the bodies they needed, scavengers willing to risk everything for the chance of coin, mercenaries too desperate to ask questions, and refugees with nothing left to lose. Recruitment? The Jackals began moving through the camp, spreading word that they were hiring. The promise of food, protection, and a share of the profits was enough to draw a crowd. Men and women of all shapes and sizes gathered around, their eyes hollow with hunger and desperation. Rook stood before them, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the mob. "You've all come here for the same reason, to make something of yourselves. Mordheim has taken everything from you, your homes, your families, your dignity, but it's also a place of opportunity. If you have the courage to seize it, I can offer you a way out of this hell. Fight for me, and you'll not only survive, you'll prosper." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For many it was the first glimmer of hope they'd heard in weeks. Rook's words had a way of cutting through the noise, sinking into the hearts of those who heard them. It wasn't just charisma, it was control. A subtle, insidious influence that made people want to follow him, even when they knew it might lead to their doom. The beggar's warning. As the Jackals prepared to leave with their new recruits, Rook felt a tug on his cloak. He turned to see a figure crouched in the shadows, a bent old man wrapped in tattered rags. His face was obscured by grime and his eyes glinted with an unsettling light. "You think you're different, don't you?" the beggar rasped, his voice like the wind through a broken window. "Think you can take from this place and not pay the price?" Rook frowned but didn't pull away. Something about the man held his attention, though he couldn't say why. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone even. The beggar chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Just a fool who thought he could outsmart this city. Thought I could use the stone without it using me." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of rot. "But no one gets away clean. Not you, not your followers. You think you control it, but it's already controlling you." Rook's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." But I do," the beggar replied. "I've seen men like you before, strong, clever, full of plans. And I've seen what happens to them when the stone sinks its claws in. You think your warband is loyal, think they'll follow you to the end. They're already slipping, boy. The stone will tear them apart, one by one." For a moment, Rook felt a flicker of doubt, an uncharacteristic hesitation that he quickly buried. He pulled away from the beggar, his expression hardening. "Stay out of my way, old man," he said coldly, "or you'll regret it." The beggar only laughed as Rook turned and walked away, his laughter echoing through the ruins long after he was gone. Tensions rising. Back at their hideout within the city, the Jackals began sorting through their recruits and supplies. The newcomers were a sorry-looking bunch, but they would serve as cannon fodder if nothing else. Rook watched them with a critical eye, his thoughts returning to the beggar's cryptic warning. Meanwhile, tensions within the warband were beginning to surface. Dag Kranth, still nursing his wounds from the last battle, had grown more aggressive, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Risa Greel was becoming increasingly secretive, disappearing for hours at a time to work on her alchemical experiments. Even Lask Lorn, usually the most easygoing of the group, had started to question Rook's decisions more openly. As the night wore on, Rook found himself alone in his quarters, the weight of his leadership pressing down on him like never before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of reflections, the crystalline powder catching the faint green glow of a nearby lantern. He hesitated for a moment, then uncorked the vial and inhaled a small dose. The effect was immediate, a surge of clarity, focus, and strength that washed away his doubts and fears. But beneath the euphoria there was something else, a whisper, faint and insidious, that seemed to echo the beggar's warning, a fractured path. As dawn broke over Mordheim, the Jackals prepared to move out once more. They had new recruits, fresh supplies, and enough wyrdstone to fund their next shipment. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Rook knew he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not to his enemies, not to his warband, and certainly not to himself. But the beggar's words lingered in his mind, a reminder that in Mordheim, power always came with a price. And deep down, he couldn't. Chapter 7. The Refugees of Mordheim. The city of Mordheim rose like a cursed monument on the horizon, its jagged silhouette wreathed in the sickly green haze of wyrdstone corruption. For the Veiled Jackals, it was both a haven and a trap, a place where fortunes could be made or lives lost with a single misstep. Yet it was here they returned, driven by necessity and desperation. Their last few shipments had cost them dearly in men, supplies, and wyrdstone. They needed to regroup, resupply, and rebuild their strength. A gathering of the damned. The outskirts of Mordheim were as chaotic as the city itself. Ragged scavengers, mercenaries, and would-be warlords clustered around the ruins like vultures, eking out a grim existence on the edges of the cursed city. Tents and makeshift shelters dotted the landscape, forming a sprawling refugee camp, where desperation was the only currency more abundant than wyrdstone. The Veiled Jackals entered the camp under the cover of dusk, their presence immediately drawing wary glances and whispered conversations. Kellen Rook led the way, his cloak pulled tightly around him. Beside him, Risa Greel carried a satchel of vials and tools, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. Dag Kranth loomed behind them, his sheer size and the blood-stained hammer slung across his back serving as a clear warning to anyone who might consider crossing them. Lask Lorn, ever the scout, drifted in and out of the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats or opportunities. "The place gets worse every time we come back," Lask muttered, stepping over a filthy beggar who clutched at his boot. "Didn't think that was possible." "It's Mordheim," Risa replied flatly. "There's no bottom to this pit." Rook ignored them, his attention focused on the crowd. This was where they would find the bodies they needed. Scavengers willing to risk everything for the chance of coin, mercenaries too desperate to ask questions, and refugees with nothing left to lose. Recruitment. The Jackals began moving through the camp, spreading word that they were hiring. The promise of food, protection, and a share of the profits was enough to draw a crowd. Men and women of all shapes and sizes gathered around, their eyes hollow with hunger and desperation. Rook stood before them, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the mob. "You've all come here for the same reason, to make something of yourselves. Mordheim has taken everything from you, your homes, your families, your dignity. but it's also a place of opportunity. If you have the courage to seize it, I can offer you a way out of this hell. Fight for me, and you'll not only survive, you'll prosper." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For many, it was the first glimmer of hope they'd heard in weeks. Rook's words had a way of cutting through the noise, sinking into the hearts of those who heard them. It wasn't just charisma, it was control, a subtle, insidious influence that made people want to follow him, even when they knew it might lead to their doom. The beggar's warning. As the Jackals prepared to leave with their new recruits, Rook felt a tug on his cloak. He turned to see a figure crouched in the shadows, a bent old man wrapped in tattered rags. His face was obscured by grime, and his eyes glinted with an unsettling light. "You think you're different, don't you?" the beggar rasped, his voice like the wind through a broken window. "Think you can take from this place and not pay the price?" Rook frowned but didn't pull away. Something about the man held his attention, though he couldn't say why. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone even. The beggar chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Just a fool who thought he could outsmart this city. Thought I could use the stone without it using me." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of rot. "But no one gets away clean. Not you, not your followers. You think you control it, but it's already controlling you." Rook's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." "Oh, but I do," the beggar replied. "I've seen men like you before, strong, clever, full of plans. And I've seen what happens to them when the stone sinks its claws in. You think your warband is loyal? Think they'll follow you to the end? They're already slipping, boy. The stone will tear them apart, one by one." For a moment, Rook felt a flicker of doubt, an uncharacteristic hesitation that he quickly buried. He pulled away from the beggar, his expression hardening. "Stay out of my way, old man," he said coldly, "or you'll regret it." The beggar only laughed as Rook turned and walked away, his laughter echoing through the ruins long after he was gone. Tensions rising. Back at their hideout within the city, the Jackals began sorting through their recruits and supplies. The newcomers were a sorry-looking bunch, but they would serve as cannon fodder if nothing else. Rook watched them with a critical eye, his thoughts returning to the beggar's cryptic warning. Meanwhile, tensions within the warband were beginning to surface. Dag Kranth, still nursing his wounds from the last battle, had grown more aggressive, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Risa Griel was becoming increasingly secretive, disappearing for hours at a time to work on her alchemical experiments. Even Lasklorn, usually the most easygoing of the group, had started to question Rook's decisions more openly. As the night wore on, Rook found himself alone in his quarters, the weight of his leadership pressing down on him like never before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of reflections, the crystalline powder catching the faint green glow of a nearby lantern. He hesitated for a moment, then uncorked the vial and inhaled a small dose. The effect was immediate, a surge of clarity, focus, and strength that washed away his doubts and fears. But beneath the euphoria there was something else, a whisper, faint and insidious, that seemed to echo the beggar's warning. A fractured path. As dawn broke over Mordheim, the Jackals prepared to move out once more. They had new recruits, fresh supplies, and enough wyrdstone to fund their next shipment. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Rook knew he couldn't afford to show weakness, not to his enemies, not to his warband, and certainly not to himself. But the beggar's words lingered in his mind, a reminder that in Mordheim, power always came with a price. And deep down, he could. Chapter 9. Night of Shadows. The Averland way station was quiet beneath the pale light of the twin moons, Arsleb's faint green glow casting an unnatural pall over the trading post. The Jackal's smuggling operation was well hidden among the unassuming warehouses, where barrels of grain and crates of iron concealed their true treasure, wyrdstone shards, refined and ready to be shipped to markets across the empire. Kellen Rook had chosen this location carefully. Its isolation and proximity to key trade routes made it the perfect waypoint for smuggling, and his network of corrupted merchants ensured minimal scrutiny. But no plan was foolproof, not when witch hunters were involved. The raid begins. Inside the largest warehouse, Last Lorne leaned casually against a stack of crates, his daggers glinting faintly in the moonlight. The air was heavy with the faint hum of wyrdstone, an eerie resonance that seemed to vibrate in the bones. "I don't like this," Lask muttered, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. "Too quiet." "Relax," said one of the guards, a burly man armed with a crossbow. "We're miles from Mordheim. No one's coming out here." Lask frowned but said nothing. His instincts, honed over years of surviving in Mordheim, told him otherwise. There was something in the air tonight, something wrong. His suspicions were confirmed moments later, when the heavy wooden doors of the warehouse burst open with a thunderous crash. Figures cloaked in black and silver stormed inside, their torches casting flickering light on the startled jackals. At their head was a man whose wide-brimmed hat and gleaming sigil of Sigmar marked him unmistakably. Witch hunter Elias Vran. "By order of the Holy Church of Sigmar, you are condemned," Vren's voice rang out, cold and authoritative. "Lay down your arms and prepare to face judgment, heretics." Chaos erupted. A desperate escape. The jackals scrambled as the witch hunters surged forward, swords flashing in the torchlight. Lask cursed under his breath and drew his daggers, slicing through the ropes that secured a stack of barrels. The barrels tumbled to the ground, creating a crude barricade between the jackals and their attackers. "Fall back," Lask shouted to the others. "Protect the shipment." Risa Grail, who had been overseeing the loading of the wyrdstone, grabbed her satchel of alchemical tools and hurled a vial toward the advancing witch hunters. The glass shattered on impact, releasing a thick green smoke that filled the air with a choking, acrid stench. The witch hunters hesitated, their charge slowed by the noxious cloud, but Vren pressed forward, his sword cutting through the smoke as though it were nothing. His eyes burned with righteous fury as he closed in on the fleeing jackals. Kellen Rook appeared from the shadows, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Lask, get the carts moving. Risa, cover the retreat." Risa nodded, pulling another vial from her satchel. This one detonated in a burst of bright, blinding light, momentarily disorienting the witch hunters. "Gow, gow," Lask shouted, helping to unhook one of the wagons loaded with wyrdstone. But as the jackals began their retreat, a volley of crossbow bolts struck the wagon's wheels, splintering the wood and sending the precious cargo tumbling to the ground. "No," Ushkaski laughed shouted, but it was too late. The shipment was lost. The witch hunter's discovery. As the jackals melted into the shadows, abandoning the ruined wagon, Vren stood over the spilled wyrdstone. The green shards pulsed faintly in the moonlight, their unholy energy palpable. Vren murmured, crouching to examine the spilled contents. Among the shards he found a small vial of crystalline powder, the substance Risa had created. He uncorked the vial cautiously, sniffing the faintly shimmering powder inside. One of his men approached, his face pale as he stared at the wyrdstone. "Sir, this is different. It's not raw wyrdstone." Rin rose to his full height, his expression grim. "No, it's worse. This reflections, they call it. I've heard whispers of it from the merchants we interrogated. A refined form of wyrdstone, designed not just to corrupt but to enslave." He held up the vial, the crystalline powder catching the light of his torch. "This is the tool of heretics, of chaos itself. It bends the mind, shatters the soul, and leaves nothing but a shell for the ruinous powers to fill." "What do I do, sir?" the man asked, his voice trembling. Ren's grip tightened around the vial. "We burn it. Every last shard, every trace of this heresy and the vermin who spread it. The Veiled Jackals have become a blight upon this land, and they will be purged in Sigmar's name." He turned to his men, his voice rising with conviction. "The Jackals are no longer just a band of scavengers. They are corruptors, puppeteers of chaos, and they will not be allowed to fester. From this moment forward, they are our priority. We will hunt them to the ends of the earth if we must." The witch hunters saluted, their faces set with grim determination. The cost of failure. Far from the burning ruins of the warehouse, the Jackals regrouped in a secluded glade. The night was silent save for the labored breathing of the survivors. Lask paced angrily, his dagger still in hand. "We lost the shipment," he spat, glaring at Rook. "Do you have any idea what that's going to cost us?" Rook's expression was unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Better to lose a shipment than our lives. We can replace the wyrdstone. We can't replace the Jackals." Lask shook his head. "You think the merchants are going to trust us now? We're bleeding power, Rook. If we don't hit back—" "We will," Rook interrupted, his voice sharp. "But not until I say so." Risa, who had been tending to the wounded, stood and crossed her arms. "They were ready for us. They knew exactly where to strike. Someone tipped them off." Her words hung in the air like a curse. The Jackals exchanged uneasy glances, suspicion creeping into their eyes. "Enough," Rook said, his voice hard. "We'll deal with this later. For now, we regroup and prepare for the next move." But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt crept into his mind. The witch hunters were closing in, and the cracks within the Jackals were beginning to widen. Vren's oath. Back at the smoldering ruins of the warehouse, Vren stood amidst the ashes, the faint green glow of wyrdstone shards reflecting in his cold eyes. He drew his sword and held it aloft, the light of the moons glinting off its polished steel. "By Sigmar's will, these heretics will fall," he vowed. "Their corruption will be cleansed, and their souls delivered to the flame." The hunt for the Veiled Jackals had begun in earnest, and Vren would not rest until their ashes lay scattered in the winds of Mordheim. Chapter 10. The Price of Power. The silence of Mordheim was an oppressive thing. It pressed against the ears, a heavy absence, punctuated only by the distant wail of the wind and the occasional unsettling echoes of something moving in the ruins. For the Veiled Jackals, silence should have been a relief after the chaos of their recent losses, but it was anything but. The fractures within the warband were widening, and none more so than in Kellenruck himself. The strain of leadership. Rook sat alone in the shadows of the warband's hideout, staring at a vial of reflections resting on the table before him. The crystalline powder inside shimmered faintly, its glow almost hypnotic. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, as he fought the urge to take another dose. The battle within him was growing harder to fight. The substance had become his crutch, a tool he convinced himself he needed to stay sharp, to keep the warband together. And yet, he couldn't ignore the whispers at the edges of his mind, faint voices that seemed to grow louder with every dose. He tipped the vial slightly, watching the powder swirl inside. It seemed alive, responding to his touch. The voices returned, faint but insistent, like a chorus of mockery. "They'll betray you," the whispers hissed. "Risa, Lask, even Dag. They all want your power. They'll take it from you the first chance they get." Rook's head snapped up, his eyes darting around the room. "Shut up," he muttered under his breath, though there was no one there to hear him. "You're wrong. They're loyal." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Visions of betrayal. Later that night, as the rest of the warband slept, Rook wandered the crumbling corridors of their hideout. The wyrdstone's faint green glow illuminated the jagged walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Rook's footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound stretching and twisting until it became a cacophony of voices. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt. The shadows around him writhed, coalescing into shapes, familiar shapes. Risa appeared before him, her face twisted into a sneer. "You think I'm loyal to you?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't need you. I have the wyrdstone. I have the power." Behind her, Dag loomed, his massive frame blocking out the faint light. "You're weak, Rook," Dag growled. "You've always been weak. If you can't lead us, I will." Then came Lask, his daggers glinting as he stepped from the shadows. "You've made too many mistakes, Rook. Maybe it's time someone else took over." The visions closed in, their voices overlapping, accusing, condemning. Rook stumbled back, his breathing ragged. "No, no. This isn't real," he shouted, drawing his dagger and slashing at the air. The shadows dissolved into nothingness, leaving him alone once more. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing. Risa's experiments. In another part of the hideout, Risa Grill was hard at work in her alchemical workshop. The faint green light of her wyrdstone experiments reflected in her eyes as she carefully measured powders and liquids, combining them in bubbling flasks and steaming crucibles. The latest batch of reflections sat on the table before her, its crystalline shards gleaming with an otherworldly brilliance. But it wasn't enough, not for Risa. She had seen what the substance could do, how it could bend the minds of the weak and elevate the strong. But she wanted more. Her latest experiments pushed the limits of what the wyrdstone could do. She had begun combining it with other reagents, volatile compounds scavenged from Mordheim's ruins. The results were unpredictable, dangerous. Some concoctions exploded with devastating force, while others emitted fumes that made her vision swim and her thoughts blur. But she couldn't stop. The power of the wyrdstone was intoxicating, and she was determined to master it. As she worked, Dag entered the room, his heavy footsteps shaking the floor. He watched her for a moment, his face unreadable. "You're spending a lot of time with that stuff," he said finally. Risa didn't look up. "It's what keeps us alive, Dag. Or have you forgotten that?" "I haven't forgotten," Dag said, stepping closer. "But it's dangerous, and not just to our enemies." Risa turned to face him, her expression cold. "If you have a problem with how I do things, take it up with Ruck." "Oh, wait. He's too busy feeding his own addiction to care, isn't he?" Dag's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and left, leaving Risa alone with her experiments. The price of power. By the next morning, the tension within the warband was palpable. Lask avoided Risa's workshop entirely, his distrust of her growing with each passing day. Dag's temper was shorter than ever, his reliance on reflections making him unpredictable, and Rook sat in the shadows, his eyes hollow, his mind a storm of doubt and paranoia. The cracks in the Veiled Jackals were widening, and everyone could feel it. Yet none of them spoke of it openly. They all clung to the belief that they could hold things together, that they could push through the chaos and come out stronger on the other side. But deep down they all knew the truth. Mordheim demanded a price for its power, and the Veiled Jackals were already paying it. As the day wore on, Rook called the warband together to plan their next move. But even as he spoke, the whispers lingered in the back of his mind, growing louder with each passing moment. "They'll betray you," the voices said. "It's only a matter of time." And as Rook looked into the eyes of his followers, he couldn't help but wonder if the voices were right. Chapter 11. The Witch Hunter's Net. The tavern in Averheim's trade district was alive with the clamor of merchants, travelers, and dock workers. Its dimly lit interior smelled of stale ale and damp wood, a haven for whispered deals and clandestine arrangements. At a table in the far corner, a heavy-set man sat nursing a tankard of beer. His name was Borlek, a merchant with a growing reputation for dealing in rare and illicit goods. Unbeknownst to the patrons bustling around him, Borlek was no longer the free trader he had once been. The shadows at his back belonged to witch hunter Elias Vren, who stood silently by the door, his steely gaze fixed on the merchant. Borlik had been caught days ago, and under the heat of Vren's righteous interrogation he had confessed everything: his ties to the Veiled Jackals, his smuggling of reflections, and his desperate dependence on the wyrdstone substance. Now he served a new purpose: bait, setting the trap. "Remember your instructions," Vren said coldly as he leaned over Borlik's shoulder. "You will meet with the Jackal's contact as planned. You will deliver the goods, and you will not deviate from the script." Borlik shuddered, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "And if they notice something's off?" Vren's gloved hand rested heavily on the man's shoulder. Benyal stalled. "Long enough for us to do what must be done. Your life is already forfeit, Borlik. The only question is whether it will end in Sigmar's grace or in the fires of heresy." Borlik nodded shakily, clutching his tankard as though it might offer some form of protection. Vren straightened, adjusting his wide-brimmed hat. His retinue of witch hunters, grim-faced and heavily armed, stood ready in the shadows outside the tavern. Each man bore the sigil of Sigmar and carried weapons anointed to combat both heretics and the foul creatures of chaos. They had spent weeks tracking the Jackals, and now the trap was. The Jackals take the bait. In the crumbling alleys outside the tavern, Lask Lorn crouched behind a stack of barrels, watching Borlik through the fogged window. The Jackals had received word of this meeting days ago, and Rook had ordered Lask to oversee the exchange personally. "Borlik's a worm," Lask muttered to himself, his breath visible in the cold night air. "But he moves enough wyrdstone to keep us in business. Let's hope he doesn't grow a spine at the wrong moment." Behind him, two of the Jackals' hired muscle waited with a small wagon, the goods concealed beneath a tarp. Lask tapped the hilt of his dagger, his instincts prickling with unease. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He signaled to his men. "Stay sharp. If this goes sideways, we get out fast." Lask slipped into the tavern, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime blending into shadows. He approached Borlik's table, his smile casual but his eyes sharp. "Borlik," he said, sliding into the seat opposite the merchant, "you've been a hard man to find." Borlik forced a grin, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured to the tankard in front of him. "Busy times, friend. The goods are ready, as promised." "Good," Lask said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's see them." Borlik hesitated, his gaze darting briefly to the door. Lask's smile faded, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "What's the hold-up?" Lask asked, his tone cold. Before Borlik could answer, the door to the tavern burst open. The ambush. Witch hunter Elias Vren entered the room like a storm, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his sharp features. His retinue followed close behind, their weapons drawn and their torches blazing with holy fire. "By the authority of Sigmar, you are all condemned," Vren declared, his voice cutting through the tavern's clamor like a blade. Chaos erupted as patrons scrambled to escape, overturning tables and chairs in their panic. Lask bolted to his feet, drawing his daggers in one fluid motion. "Trap!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din. Viren's men moved with precision, their crossbows aimed at Lask and the other Jackals. Borlik cowered beneath the table, his hands over his head as the witch hunters advanced. Lask threw a dagger at the nearest witch hunter, the blade sinking into the man's shoulder. The attacker staggered but didn't fall, his faith driving him forward. Lask cursed and ducked as a crossbow bolt whizzed past his head, embedding itself in the wall behind him. "Get the goods out," Lask shouted to his men outside. The Jackals retreat. Outside the tavern, the two Jackals guarding the wagon heard the commotion and sprang into action. They began pulling the wagon down the alley, but Vren's men were already upon them. One of the witch hunters, a massive man wielding a warhammer, struck the wagon with a powerful blow, shattering its axle. The tarp fell away, revealing the crates of wyrdstone beneath. "Seize it," Vren commanded, stepping into the alley. Lask emerged from the tavern, blood streaming from a shallow cut on his cheek. He took in the scene, the ruined wagon, the fallen jackals, and the triumphant witch hunters, and knew the operation was lost. "Scatter!" he yelled, signaling the remaining jackals to retreat. He threw another dagger, this one aimed at Vren. The witch hunter deflected it with his sword, his expression cold and unyielding. "This is just the beginning, heretic," Vren said, his voice low and menacing. Lask gave him a mocking salute before disappearing into the shadows, leaving the shattered operation behind. The discovery. As the last of the jackals fled into the night, Vren turned his attention to the crates of wyrdstone. Among the shards he found several vials of reflections, their crystalline powder glowing faintly in the torchlight. He held up one of the vials, studying it with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "This is their weapon," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "A poison of the soul, designed to enslave and corrupt." One of his men approached, his expression grim. "We've secured the cargo, sir. What are your orders?" "Burn it," Vren said. "Burn it all, and send word to every chapter house from here to Altdorf. The Veiled Jackals are to be hunted without mercy. They are no longer just scavengers. They are corruptors, spreading chaos wherever they tread. We will not stop until their ashes are scattered to the winds." The witch hunters worked quickly, piling the wyrdstone and reflections into a bonfire. As the flames consumed the unholy substance, Vren watched in silence, his jaw set and his eyes burning with righteous determination. The fallout. Back in Mordheim, Lask returned to the hideout with only a handful of survivors. His report was grim. The shipment was lost, and the witch hunters were closing in. Rook listened in silence, his expression unreadable. But beneath his calm exterior, fury boiled. The loss of the wyrdstone was a devastating blow, and the knowledge that Vren now understood the full scope of their operation was even worse. "We need to strike back," Lask said, his voice urgent. "If we let them keep pushing us, we're done." Rook nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. The voices had returned, louder than ever, whispering of betrayal and failure. The Veiled Jackals were on the brink, and Rook knew the price of survival would only grow steeper. For now, though, the only question was how far he was willing to go to pay it. Chapter 12. Desperate Measures. The Veiled Jackals fled under the cover of darkness, their ragged retreat marked by blood, exhaustion, and the lingering scent of wyrdstone smoke. The witch hunters had struck harder than anyone anticipated, and the jackals had paid the price. Their caravan was gone, their supplies decimated, and the relentless hounds of Sigmar were closing in. Mordheim rose before them, a city of jagged ruins and malignant shadows. It offered no comfort, only the illusion of safety. For all its dangers, Mordheim was the only place the jackals could disappear. At least for now. The retreat. The survivors limped into the desolate outskirts of Mordheim, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Lask Lorne led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Beside him, Doug Cranth trudged silently, his massive frame weighed down not by fatigue, but by a growing emptiness. Risa Greel followed close behind, clutching a satchel that contained the remnants of her alchemical experiments. She had said little during the journey, her thoughts consumed by what she would need to do next. At the rear of the group was Kellen Ruck, his cloak trailing in the dirt. His usually sharp features were drawn and gaunt, his eyes shadowed by paranoia and the after-effects of reflections. He muttered to himself as they walked, his hand never straying far from the dagger at his belt. When they finally reached their hideout, a crumbling tower buried deep within the city, Rook ordered the doors barred and the windows covered. The air inside was thick with tension, the kind that clung to every word and movement like a storm waiting to break. Paranoia takes root. In the dim light of their makeshift war room, Rook paced back and forth, his fingers twitching at his sides. The others sat or stood nearby, silent as they waited for him to speak. "How did they know?" Rook demanded, his voice low and edged with fury. "How did the witch hunters know exactly where to hit us?" Lask sighed, leaning against a broken pillar. "It was Borlek. He was weak. They probably squeezed him dry." Rook stopped pacing, his sharp gaze locking onto Lask. "Probably? You don't know for sure?" Lask straightened, his casual demeanor slipping. "I wasn't exactly in a position to interrogate the man, Rook. You sent me there to secure the goods, not play inquisitor." Rook's eyes narrowed. "And yet you failed to secure the goods, didn't you?" The tension in the room thickened as Lask and Rook stared each other down. It was Risa who finally broke the silence. "This isn't helping," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The witch hunters are the problem, not us. We need a plan, not finger-pointing." Rook turned his glare on her, but she held his gaze without flinching. After a moment, he relented, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he muttered. "But make no mistake, there's a traitor among us. Someone tipped them off, whether they realize it or not, and I will find out who." Risa's work. Later that night, while the others rested or tended to their wounds, Risa locked herself in her alchemical workshop. The satchel she had carried was laid out before her, its contents glinting faintly in the green glow of wyrdstone. Her experiments had already pushed the boundaries of what was possible with the substance, but now she needed something more, something stronger. The warband was on the brink of collapse, and Rook's paranoia was growing by the day. If they were going to survive, they needed an edge. For hours, Risa worked in silence, combining wyrdstone powder with volatile reagents scavenged from the ruins of Mordheim. The air filled with acrid fumes, and the glass vials on her table trembled as her concoctions reacted violently. Finally, as dawn began to break, she held up a small, crystalline shard. It was unlike anything she had created before, its surface shimmering with an almost liquid quality. She called it Shards of the Veil. Shards of the Veil. Risa tested the shard on a rat she had captured earlier, placing a small fragment near the creature. The effects were immediate. The rat's movements became unnaturally fast, its eyes glowing faintly green as it darted around the cage. For a moment, it seemed invincible, a predator unleashed. But the effects didn't last. Within minutes, the rat collapsed, its body racked with spasms, its fur fell away in clumps, and its flesh seemed to wither before Risa's eyes. She stared at the lifeless creature, her expression unreadable. The power of Shards of the Veil was undeniable. It granted unparalleled clarity and strength, but at a terrible cost. Risa knew it was dangerous, perhaps even suicidal, but that didn't matter. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Rook's breaking point. As the others gathered the next morning, Risa presented her findings to Rook. She placed the shard on the table between them, its strange glow casting flickering light across their faces. "This," she said, "is our answer. It's stronger than reflections, faster, more potent. It will give us the edge we need." Rook picked up the shard, holding it to the light. The voices in his head whispered louder as he stared into its depths. "And the cost?" he asked, his voice low. Risa hesitated. "It's unstable. The effects are short-lived and it takes a toll, but if used carefully—" "Carefully," Lask interrupted, his tone sharp. "This stuff killed a rat, Risa. What do you think it'll do to us?" "It's a tool," Risa shot back, "like any other. The question is whether we're willing to use it." Rook turned the shard over in his hands, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set it down and looked at Risa. "Make more," he said. Lask stared at him in disbelief. "Rook, you can't be serious." "We don't have a choice," Rook snapped, cutting him off. "The witch hunters are coming, Lask. If we don't act now, we're finished." The room fell silent. Lask shook his head and turned away, muttering curses under his breath. Risa nodded and gathered her supplies, already planning the next batch. Rook sat back in his chair, his mind a storm of paranoia and desperation. The price of power was steep, but he had already decided it was a price he was willing to pay. Chapter 13. The Veil Breaks. The green haze of wyrdstone hung heavy in the crumbling tower that served as the Veiled Jackals' hideout. The tension within the warband had reached a breaking point. Weeks of paranoia, mounting losses, and the ceaseless pressure of the witch hunters closing in had left the group fractured and raw. The air felt electric with unspoken accusations, simmering resentment, and the growing awareness that their survival might come at the cost of their humanity. Dag's descent. Dag Krenth sat alone in a dark corner of the hideout, his massive hands trembling as he held a vial of Shards of the Veil. The crystalline substance glinted faintly in the dim light, calling to him with an almost hypnotic allure. Dag had always been the warband's brute force, its shield against the chaos of Mordheim, but the weight of his role had grown unbearable. The battles, the losses, and the whispers of failure gnawed at him. He had been Rook's hammer, but now he felt more like a tool, expendable, replaceable. The reflections he had relied on for strength were no longer enough. He needed more. "Yath a little," he muttered to himself, uncorking the vial. "Just enough to clear my head." The moment the Shards of the Veil entered his system, Dag's body reacted violently. A surge of energy coursed through him, setting his nerves alight. His muscles tightened, his vision sharpened, and for a brief, glorious moment he felt unstoppable. But the euphoria quickly turned to agony. His skin flushed, veins bulging, as if his body were struggling to contain the power. His mind clouded with rage, and the whispers of wyrdstone corruption grew into a deafening roar. "Traitors," he bellowed, his voice a guttural snarl. "You're all against me." The rampage. The sound of Dag's roar drew the other jackals from their tasks. Lask, Risa, and Rook rushed into the main chamber, their eyes widening in horror at the sight before them. Dag stood in the center of the room, his body twisted and swollen with unnatural strength. His eyes glowed faintly green, and his breath came in ragged, animalistic growls. "Dag, what are you doing?" Rook demanded, stepping forward cautiously. "You used me," Dag snarled, his voice barely human. "All of you. I've bled for this warband, killed for it, and what do I get? Nothing but lies." Rook raised a hand, trying to calm him. "No one's against you, Dag. You need to fight it. Whatever that stuff is doing to you, you need to stop." But Dag was beyond reason. With a roar, he charged at Rook, swinging his hammer with devastating force. Rook barely managed to dodge, the massive weapon splintering the table behind him. "Risa," Rook shouted, "do something!" Risa fumbled for one of her vials, but Dag was too fast. He turned on her, his glowing eyes filled with fury. "You did this to me!" he roared, lunging at her. Before he could reach her, Lask darted forward, his daggers flashing. He slashed at Dag's side, but the monstrous man barely seemed to notice. With a backhanded swing, Dag sent Lask crashing into the wall, his body crumpling to the ground. Exposure. The sound of the chaos carried far beyond the walls of the hideout. Unknown to the jackals, the commotion reached the ears of a pair of witch hunter informants skulking in the ruins nearby. They crept closer, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the figures involved. "It's them," one whispered. "The jackals." The other nodded, already preparing to signal their masters. Rook's decision. Back inside the hideout, Rook had no choice but to act. Dag's rampage was putting everything at risk. The warband, their plans, their lives. "Dag," Rook said, his voice steady but cold. "Stand down, that's an order." Dag turned to him, his twisted face a mask of fury. "You don't give me orders anymore, Rook. You're weak. You've always been weak." Rook drew his dagger, the blade catching the faint green glow of wyrdstone. "I'm sorry, old friend," he said quietly, "but I can't let you destroy what we've built." Dag charged at him, but Rook was faster. He sidestepped the wild swing of Dag's hammer and plunged the dagger into his side. Dag roared in pain but didn't stop, his monstrous strength driving him forward. It took 3 more strikes, precise, calculated, to bring him down. With a final, ragged breath, Dag collapsed to the ground, the glow in his eyes fading as his body fell still. The aftermath. The jackals gathered around Dag's lifeless form, their faces etched with shock and grief. "That was one of us," Lask said quietly, his voice hoarse from the blow he had taken. Risa knelt beside the body, her expression unreadable. "The shards of the veil. I didn't realize they would—" "This wasn't just the shards," Rook interrupted, his voice hard. "This was all of it. The pressure, the losses, the corruption. Mordheim claims everyone eventually. The warband was silent. Dag's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a sign of the cracks that were growing within them, cracks that no amount of wyrdstone could fix. "We burn him," Rook said finally. "We can't leave anything behind." As they prepared Dag's body for the pyre, Rook's mind raced. The witch hunters were closing in, and now their position had been exposed. They couldn't stay in Mordheim much longer. But even as he planned their next move, the voices in his head grew louder. They whispered of betrayal, of weakness, of enemies hiding in the shadows. And for the first time, Rook wasn't sure if they were wrong. A shattered morale. That night, the jackals lit the pyre for Dag, the flames casting long shadows on the ruined walls of their hideout. The air was thick with smoke, and the unspoken knowledge that the warband was falling apart. Rook stood apart from the others, staring into the flames. The price of power was steep, and he was beginning to wonder if it was one he could afford to pay. In the distance, hidden in the ruins, the witch hunter informants watched the pyre burn. One of them smiled grimly, already preparing their report. The jackals thought they were safe. They thought they could still win. But the net was closing around them, and soon there would be no escape. Chapter 14. The Hunt Intensifies. The chill air of Mordheim was heavy with the scent of decay, wyrdstone corruption wafting through the ruins like an invisible poison. Once a bustling trade hub, the city had been reduced to an accursed labyrinth of crumbling buildings and shattered monuments. Its spires, broken by the comet's fall, jutted into the sky like the ribs of a rotting beast. For witch hunter Elias Vren, it was a holy battlefield, a place where the light of Sigmar would strike the deepest shadows. Vren stood at the head of his retinue, his wide-crimmed hat casting a shadow over his sharp, gaunt features. Behind him, 20 witch hunters, their cloaks emblazoned with the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar, waited with torches and weapons ready. Their grim faces betrayed no fear, but they all knew the truth. No one entered Mordheim unscathed. Vren raised his sword, its edge gleaming faintly with the holy oils of consecration. "Brothers, this city is a festering wound on the Empire, a den of corruption and heresy. The Veiled Jackals have taken root here, spreading chaos like a plague. Today, we end it. Today, we deliver Sigmar's judgment." The men responded with a unified cry, their torches flaring as they stepped into the cursed city. Entering the beast, the witch hunters moved cautiously through the streets, their boots crunching on broken stone and scattered bones. The city's unnatural stillness set their nerves on edge. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the green glow of wyrdstone shards embedded in the ruins. "This place reeks of chaos," said Captain Adalric Toth, Vren's second-in-command. He tightened his grip on his warhammer, his eyes scanning the buildings for any sign of movement. "It's more than chaos," Vren replied. "It's corruption incarnate. Wyrdstone doesn't just destroy, it twists, warps. Whatever lives here isn't human anymore." Their path led them deeper into the city, past collapsed marketplaces and desecrated temples. The ruins seemed to close in around them, the green haze growing thicker with every step. Then came the sounds. faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but growing louder. A wet, guttural chittering, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. "Eyes up!" Ven barked, raising his sword. From the shadows, they emerged. The abominations. The creatures were grotesque mockeries of life, their bodies bloated and twisted by wyrdstone's foul influence. One was a mass of fused limbs, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light as it crawled toward the witch hunters on 6 malformed legs. Another resembled a man, but its flesh was pocked with wyrdstone crystals, its jaw distended into a fanged maw. "Sigmar, preserve us," one of the younger witch hunters whispered, his voice trembling. Vuren stepped forward unshaken. "Steel your hearts. They are but beasts, and the hammer of Sigmar strikes down all evil." With a cry, the witch hunters charged. The first abomination lunged at Toth, its claws raking against his shield. He swung his warhammer in a wide arc, the blessed weapon connecting with the creature's skull in a sickening crunch. It collapsed, but 2 more took its place, their inhuman screeches echoing through the ruins. Vern moved with precision, his sword slicing through the neck of a creature that lunged at him from the side. Holy fire trailed the blade, searing the flesh as the abomination fell. But the creatures were relentless. They swarmed the witch hunters, their warped bodies defying logic as they attacked with claws, fangs, and raw brute force. "Hold the line," Vren shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not falter." The cost of purity. The battle raged for what felt like hours. When it was over, the witch hunters stood victorious, but at a terrible cost. 4 of their number lay dead, their bodies torn and broken. Others nursed wounds that bled freely, their armor dented and smeared with the black ichor of the creatures. Toth wiped the blood from his hammer, his face grim. "These things. They're worse than the stories." "I had a warning," Vren replied, his tone cold. "This is what wyrdstone does to those who succumb to its influence. It twists the body and enslaves the soul, and the Veiled Jackals are no different. They've chosen this path. They will share the same fate." He turned to the surviving witch hunters, his gaze sweeping over their bloodied faces. "Burn the bodies. We leave no trace of this corruption behind." As the pyres were lit, the green glow of the wyrdstone crystals in the creature's flesh faded, consumed by the cleansing fire. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, but Vren stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the flames. A new target. As the witch hunters regrouped, a scout approached Vren, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Sir," the scout said, saluting, "we've found something. A trail. Marks leading deeper into the city. It could be them." Vren's eyes narrowed. "The Jackals?" The scout nodded. "It's likely. Supplies. Footprints. They've been moving through here recently." Toth frowned. "If they've made it this deep, they'll be entrenched. We'll be fighting them on their terms." "Then we'll flush them out," Vran said. "The Jackals believe they can hide behind these ruins, that the darkness of Mordheim will shield them. But Sigmar's light shines even here." He sheathed his sword and addressed his men. "We press on. The Jackals are close, I can feel it. Their time is running out, and soon they will face the judgment they've evaded for far too long." Corruption rising. As the witch hunters marched deeper into the city, the ruins seemed to grow more alive. The very walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the wyrdstone corruption had taken root in the stone itself. Vren ignored the oppressive atmosphere, his focus fixed on the task ahead. But deep down, even he could feel the weight of the city pressing on his soul. Mordheim was a place of madness, a graveyard of empires, and no one left it unchanged. Still he would not falter. The Veiled Jackals were within his grasp, and he would see them destroyed, even if it meant confronting the full horrors of the city. Chapter 15. A Fractured Band. The Jackals' hideout in Mordheim was falling apart, both physically and figuratively. The jagged tower they had claimed as their sanctuary trembled under the weight of distrust and paranoia. Its crumbling walls seemed to mirror the state of the warband itself, fractured, unstable, and ready to collapse. Boiling tensions. The hideout was eerily quiet as the remaining members of the Veiled Jackals gathered around a sputtering fire. The air between them was thick with unspoken accusations, their once tight bond now stretched to the breaking point. Lask Lorne leaned against a broken column, his sharp eyes darting between the others. His hand rested casually on the hilt of his dagger, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. "This is getting us nowhere," Lask muttered, breaking the silence. "We're sitting in this cursed ruin, waiting for the witch hunters to kick down the door. If we stay here, we're dead." "Where do you think we'll go, Lask?" Risa Greel shot back, her voice cold. She sat cross-legged near her alchemical table, her hands absently toying with a shard of wyrdstone. "Every route out of this city is watched. You think you can just slip past them and stroll into Averland?" Lask narrowed his eyes. "Better to take my chances out there than rot in here while Rook tries to hold this mess together." At the mention of his name, Kellen Rook stirred. He sat in the shadows, his face partially obscured by the flickering light of the fire. His sharp features were gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and overuse of reflections. He had been quiet for most of the evening, but now his voice cut through the room like a blade. "Enough," Rook said, his tone low but deadly. "You think I don't see what's happening? The cracks in this warband, the whispers behind my back." Lask turned to face him fully, his voice laced with frustration. "Maybe if you stopped chasing ghosts and actually led us, there wouldn't be whispers." Rook stood abruptly, his movements quick and erratic. "You think you can do better, Lask? Go ahead, take charge. Let's see how far your silver tongue gets you when the witch hunters come knocking." The two men glared at each other, the firelight reflecting in their eyes. "Enough," Risa said, rising to her feet. "This isn't the time for this." But it was already too late. The cracks in the warband were now fissures, and nothing would hold them together. Lask's decision. That night, while the others slept, Lask made his move. He had spent hours planning his escape, and now the moment had come. He crept through the hideout, careful not to wake the others, and made his way to the stash of wyrdstone hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He knelt and pried it open, revealing the faintly glowing shards inside. They were worth a fortune, enough to buy him passage out of Mordheim and into a life far from the madness of this cursed city. "You're making a mistake," a voice said behind him. Lask froze, his hand halfway to the stash. He turned to see Risa standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "I'm done," Lask said quietly. "This warband is falling apart, Risa. Rook's lost his mind, Dag's dead, and you're so wrapped up in your wyrdstone experiments you can't see what's happening around you." Risa didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer, her eyes flickering between Lask and the stash. "You think you can just walk away? You know what happens to deserters." Lask smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Let him come after me. He's too far gone to find his own shadow, let alone me." Risa hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'll regret this," she said softly. "Maybe," Lask replied, grabbing a handful of wyrdstone shards and slipping them into a satchel. "But at least I'll still be alive to regret it." The fallout. When morning came, the warband awoke to find the stash raided and Lask gone. The discovery sent Rook into a frenzy. He stormed through the hideout, overturning tables and smashing chairs as he ranted. "Traitor," he shouted, his voice echoing off the crumbling walls. "I knew it. I knew he was working against me." Risa watched from the corner, her expression guarded. "He's not working against you, Rook. He's just trying to survive." Rook turned on her, his eyes wild. "Don't defend him. He's a coward, and worse, he's a thief. He stole from us, stole from me." "Maybe he's not the only one you should blame," Risa said carefully. "This warband didn't fall apart on its own. For a moment, Rook looked as though he might strike her. Instead, he spun away, pacing like a caged animal. "This is Vren's doing," he muttered. "Lask is working with him. It's the only explanation. He's led them right to us." Reza frowned. "You're jumping at shadows, Rook. Lask may have left, but he's not working with the witch hunters." "How do you know?" Rook snapped. "How do I know you're not working with them?" Reza stepped back, her expression darkening. "Careful, Rook. You're starting to sound like Deg before he lost it." Rook glared at her, but he said nothing. Instead, he stormed out of the room, leaving the others to deal with the aftermath of Lask's betrayal. A fractured bay. With Lask gone and the stash depleted, the Veiled Jackals were on the brink of collapse. Rook's growing paranoia had turned him into a shadow of the leader he once was, and the others could feel the weight of his madness pressing down on them. Reza returned to her alchemical experiments, her mind racing with thoughts of how to salvage the situation, but even she knew that the warband's days were numbered. As for Rook, he sat alone in the shadows of his quarters, a vial of reflections in his hand. The voices in his head were louder than ever, whispering of betrayal and vengeance. "They'll all turn on you," the voices hissed. "Lask was just the beginning. Reza, the others, they're just waiting for their chance." Rook clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "Then I'll deal with them," he muttered. "One by one if I have to." The warband was no longer a unified force. It was a collection of broken pieces, each one pulling in a different direction, and as the witch hunters closed in, the jackals were running out of time to put themselves back together. Chapter 16. Web of Lies. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ruined countryside as Las Lorne crouched behind a crumbling wall. His heart pounded in his chest, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. He had spent the past 2 days running, always looking over his shoulder, the green glow of wyrdstone shards in his satchel a reminder of the warband he had left behind. He was free, or so he thought. The witch hunter's net. Lask had barely stepped out onto the open road when they fell upon him. The first blow came from behind, a heavy boot slamming into his back and driving him to the ground. His dagger clattered from his grasp as he rolled, reaching for another weapon, but it was too late. A crossbow bolt thunked into the dirt beside his hand, and a sharp voice barked an order. "Stay down, heretic." Lask froze. He looked up to see a circle of witch hunters, their weapons gleaming in the fading sunlight. At their center was Elias Vren, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his piercing eyes. Well, Vren said, stepping forward. "The Veiled Jackals, elusive little rat. How far did you think you'd run before Sigmar's light found you?" Lask forced a grin, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Farther than this, apparently." Vren didn't smile. He motioned to his men, who yanked Lask to his feet and bound his hands behind his back. "We've been watching you," Vren said. "Ever since you slipped away from your so-called brothers. You've led us quite the merry chase, but it ends here. You're going to tell us everything." Lask spat on the ground. "You'll get nothing from me." Vren tilted his head, a faint smile finally curling his lips. "Oh, I think you'll find that the truth has a way of surfacing, eventually." Interrogation. The witch hunters dragged Lask to their temporary camp on the outskirts of Mordheim, where they secured him to a heavy wooden chair in the center of a makeshift tent. Vren stood before him, his arms crossed, while Captain Toth prepared the tools of their grim trade, iron tongs, sharp blades, and the ever-present brand of Sigmar. "I'll ask once," Vren said, his voice calm but edged with menace. "Where are the jackals hiding?" Lask met his gaze with a defiance he didn't entirely feel. You think I'd sell them out to the likes of you? You don't know what they'd do to me if they found out." Vren leaned closer, his expression unchanging. "And you don't know what we'll do to you if you don't." For hours the witch hunters worked on him, their methods precise and brutal. Lask held out for as long as he could, but the pain, combined with the weight of his own guilt, began to break him. Finally, bloodied and trembling, he spoke. "They're in the ruins of an old watchtower," he rasped, "near the east gate of Mordheim, but they don't trust anyone. They'll have moved by now." Vren studied him carefully, weighing the truth of his words. "You've just bought yourself a little more time, Lask Lorn. Don't squander it." Raisa's doubts. Back at the Jackal's hideout, Raisa Griel was hard at work, her hands steady as she mixed volatile reagents. The air in her alchemical chamber was thick with fumes, the faint green glow of wyrdstone casting flickering shadows across the walls. Her focus was unwavering, but her mind was a storm of doubt. Rook's behavior had grown increasingly erratic since last desertion. His paranoia now extended to everyone, and his reliance on reflections was spiraling out of control. Even Dag's death, once a source of grief, had become another ghost haunting his fraying mind. Riza set down her tools and stared at the bubbling mixture before her. She couldn't deny that Rook's leadership had kept them alive this long, but now his instability was putting them all in danger. "You're hesitating," a voice said from the doorway. She turned to see Rook standing there, his eyes bloodshot and sunken, his hand resting on the pommel of his dagger. "I'm not," she replied coolly. "I'm working." "You're thinking," Rook said, stepping into the room. "About Lask, about Dag, about me." Raisa met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We can't afford to dwell on what's already happened. We need to focus on what's next." "What's next," Ruck said, his voice low, "is finishing what we started. The witch hunters are closing in and we can't afford to falter now. You understand that, don't you?" Riza nodded slowly. "I do. But you need to understand that wyrdstone can't solve everything. It's a tool, not a crutch." Ruck's jaw tightened. "It's more than a tool. It's power. And if we're going to survive, we need to embrace that power, no matter the cost." Raisa didn't respond. She turned back to her work, her mind racing. Rook's obsession with wyrdstone was becoming a liability, but she couldn't abandon him. Not yet. Her experiments were their only hope, and she needed the warband intact if they were to survive. The web tightens. As the night fell, the witch hunters prepared to move on the Jackal's hideout. Vren stood at the edge of the camp, staring out at the ruins of Mordheim. The city seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, its corruption a constant reminder of the battle they faced. "Are you sure about the information?" Toth asked, stepping up beside him. Lask spoke the truth, Vren replied. "He broke sooner than I expected, but his desperation was genuine. The Jackals are vulnerable, and now we know where to find them." "And if they've moved?" Toth asked. Vren's expression hardened. "Then we'll find them. They can't run forever." In the distance, the green haze of Mordheim hung over the ruins like a curse, a constant reminder of the darkness they were about to confront. For Lask, the ordeal was far from over. He had given up the Jackals, but he knew better than to believe the witch hunters would spare him. And for Risa, the seeds of doubt had been planted. She had always believed her work would save them, but now she wondered if it was only hastening their end. The web was tightening, and the Jackals were running out of places to hide. Chapter 17. Mordheim's Wrath. The ruins of Mordheim were eerily still as dawn broke over the shattered skyline, the ever-present green glow of wyrdstone reflected off the jagged spires and crumbling walls, casting long, twisted shadows. It was a city of death, a trap for the living, and soon, a battlefield. The Veiled Jackals knew the witch hunters were coming. Lask's betrayal had sealed their fate, and now they had no choice but to stand their ground. They had fortified what remained of their hideout, turning the ruined watchtower into a makeshift stronghold. But even the thickest walls would mean nothing against the fanatical zeal of Sigmar's servants. The witch hunters' approach. Elias Vren led his retinue through the ruined streets, their torches burning brightly in the gloom. The witch hunters moved in disciplined formation, their weapons gleaming and their faces grim. They had fought their way through chaos beasts and wyrdstone horrors to reach this point, and they were prepared for whatever lay ahead. "Stay sharp," Vrin commanded, his voice low but firm. "The jackals are desperate, and desperation makes men dangerous." Captain Adulric Toth nodded, hefting his warhammer. "Do you believe they'll stand and fight, sir?" "Differently." "They have no choice," Vren replied, "and neither do we. The corruption here must be purged, no matter the cost." As they neared the watchtower, Vren raised a hand, signaling for the group to halt. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out the signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dust, the faint glint of wyrdstone shards embedded in the walls. "They're here," he said. "Prepare to move." The jackals prepare. Inside the watchtower, the jackals readied themselves for the fight of their lives. Risa Griel worked frantically in her alchemical workshop, mixing volatile reagents and packing them into crude glass vials. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but her mind was a whirlwind of doubt and fear. "This'll buy us time," she muttered, placing the vials into a satchel. Kellen Rook stood nearby, his face pale and drawn. His paranoia had reached its peak, but the coming battle had forced his focus. He had a plan, though it was as desperate as the situation itself. "They'll come at us from the front," Rook said, addressing the remaining jackals. "We draw them into the main chamber, bottle them up, and hit them hard. Risa, your explosives will cover our retreat." "And what?" one of the newer recruits asked, his voice shaking. "Where do we go after that?" Rook fixed him with a cold stare. "Out of Mordheim. If we survive this, we're done with the city. But first, we survive." Risa glanced at him but said nothing. She knew the odds were slim, and so did he. The battle begins. The first explosion shattered the quiet of the ruins, a crude trap set by the jackals detonating as the witch hunters entered the tower's perimeter. Shrapnel and debris rained down, forcing the attackers to scatter. "Hold the line," Viren shouted, rallying his men. "Forward, in Sigmar's name!" The witch hunters advanced, their torches casting flickering light on the ruined walls. Inside, the jackals waited, weapons drawn and nerves frayed. When the two sides clashed, the sound was deafening. Swords met hammers, crossbows loosed bolts into the shadows, and the air filled with the cries of the wounded and dying. The cramped confines of the tower turned the fight into a chaotic melee, with neither side able to gain a clear advantage. Rook fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his dagger flashing as he cut down one witch hunter after another. Nearby, Dag's absence was felt keenly. Without his brute strength, the jackals struggled to hold their ground. Risa hurled one of her vials into the fray, the glass shattering on impact and releasing a cloud of toxic green smoke. The witch hunters recoiled, coughing and choking as the wyrdstone-infused fumes burned their lungs. "Fall back to the upper levels," Rook shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "Risa, now!" The explosion. Risa scrambled to the upper floor, her satchel of explosives slung over her shoulder. She had spent days perfecting the mixture, combining raw wyrdstone with volatile reagents to create something powerful enough to collapse the tower and anything inside it. As the witch hunters pressed forward, she worked quickly, setting the charges along the walls and support beams. Her hands trembled as she lit the fuses, the flickering flames racing toward their deadly payload. "Risa, move!" Rook called, pulling her away as the first charge detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The lower levels of the tower were obliterated in an instant, the force of the blast sending shockwaves through the ruins. Green fire erupted from the detonated wyrdstone, its unholy energy rippling outward like a living thing. The witch hunters were thrown back, many crushed beneath falling debris or consumed by the flames. But the explosion did more than destroy the tower. It awakened something in the city. Morden's wrath. As the dust settled, the survivors, both jackals and witch hunters, realized the true cost of the explosion. The wyrdstone's energy had corrupted the very air, twisting it into a swirling vortex of green light. From the depths of the ruins came a terrible sound. Guttural roars, inhuman shrieks, and the rhythmic pounding of something massive moving through the darkness. "Demons," Vren whispered, his face pale. "They've summoned demons." The first manifestation emerged from the smoke, a towering figure of twisted flesh and bone, its eyes burning with malice. Smaller creatures skittered in its wake, their clawed limbs scraping against the stone. "Hold your ground," Vren shouted, raising his sword. "This is the true enemy. Stand and fight." The witch hunters turned their weapons on the abominations, their holy flames barely holding the creatures at bay. Meanwhile, the jackals took advantage of the chaos. Ruck led the survivors through a hidden passage, his mind racing as the sounds of battle faded behind them. "Did you know this would happen?" one of the recruits demanded, his voice shaking. Risa didn't answer. She clutched her satchel tightly, her expression unreadable. The aftermath. By the time the jackals emerged from the ruins, the green light of the explosion still illuminated the horizon. The demonic manifestations continued to spread, drawn to the corrupted energy unleashed by the blast. Rook turned to Risa, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "What did you do?" "I did what I had to," Risa replied evenly. "We're alive, aren't we?" "For how long?" Rook demanded. "You've made this city even more dangerous than it already was." Risa didn't respond. She knew he was right, but she also knew there had been no other choice. The witch hunters had been moments away from ending them, and her actions had bought them time at a terrible cost. As the jackals disappeared into the shadows, Mordheim roared in fury behind them. The city itself seemed to writhe with corruption, its labyrinthine streets alive with horrors unleashed by the explosion. And somewhere in the ruins, Elias Vren still lived, his sword alight with holy fire as he fought against the demonic tide. His mission was far from over, and neither were the jackals' struggles. Chapter 18. The Fall of the Jackals. The ruins of Mordheim had never felt more suffocating. The green wyrdstone glow that clung to every surface was now a beacon for death, drawing the relentless gaze of witch hunters and demonic horrors alike. The Veiled Jackals, broken and battered, found no respite in the shattered city they once exploited. The explosion at their hideout had unleashed something terrible, and the consequences were closing in from all sides. The relentless hunt. Elias Vren marched through the ruins with cold determination. His surviving witch hunters moved in disciplined silence, their torches burning bright against the encroaching darkness. The horrors summoned by the wyrdstone explosion had scattered, leaving behind an eerie calm that felt more threatening than the chaos. "We'll find them," Vren said, his voice a steady anchor for his men. "They won't make it out of this city alive. Sigmar's light will see to it." The trail of the jackals was unmistakable. Scattered supplies, bloodied footprints, and the faint traces of wyrdstone corruption in the air. Vren's zeal was unshakable, but even he couldn't ignore the toll the city was taking on his retinue. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling as they clutched their weapon. "Mordheim eats away at even the strongest minds," Toth muttered, falling in step beside Vren. "We need to finish this quickly." Vren's gaze hardened. "We finish it when the heretics are ash. Until then, we press on." Rook's madness. Deep in the heart of Mordheim, the surviving jackals huddled in a dilapidated chapel, its once grand stained glass windows shattered and replaced by wyrdstone shards that cast an unnatural light. The warband was a shadow of its former self, exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. Kellen Rook stood apart from the others, his back to them as he stared at a pile of wyrdstone shards stacked reverently on an old altar, the green light reflected in his eyes, which were sunken and bloodshot from sleepless nights and constant doses of reflections. Risa Griel approached cautiously, her voice low. "Rook, We can't stay here. The witch hunters are too close, and the daemons aren't far behind. Rook didn't respond immediately. He reached out, running his fingers over the wyrdstone shards as though they were sacred relics. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but laced with an unsettling intensity. "They can't touch us, Risa. Not if we use the stone." Risa's stomach turned. "You're talking nonsense. The wyrdstone isn't a shield, it's a curse. Look at what it's done to us, to this city." Rook turned to face her, and for a moment Risa saw a flicker of the man he used to be, but it was quickly swallowed by the madness in his eyes. "The stone is power, Risa. Power to survive, power to escape. You've seen it, felt it. We can use it to become more than this." "And the cost?" Risa asked, her voice sharp. "What price are you willing to pay, Rook?" Rook stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Any price." Betrayal. As the night dragged on, tensions within the warband reached their breaking point. Risa wasn't the only one who had noticed Rook's growing instability. The other survivors whispered among themselves, their fear of the witch hunters outweighed only by their fear of Rook. "Is he going to get us all killed?" one of the recruits muttered, his eyes darting to the entrance, as if expecting Vren to burst in at any moment. They shuffled down the hallway, with hundreds banking up behind, as if expecting Vren to burst in at any moment. "What choice do we have?" another replied. "We follow him or we die out there." But Risa had heard enough. She approached the group, her expression grim. "We can't keep following him," she said quietly. "If we stay with Rook, we're as good as dead." The recruits hesitated, their loyalty wavering. But before anyone could speak, Rook's voice rang out from the altar. "Planning something, Risa?" All eyes turned to him as he descended the steps, a dagger glinting in his hand. The green glow of the wyrdstone cast strange shadows across his face, making him look more like a specter than a man. "You think I don't see what's happening?" Rook said, his voice rising. "You think I don't know who the real traitor is?" Risa stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "This isn't about betrayal, Rook. This is about survival. You've lost your way." Rook laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "I haven't lost anything. I see clearly now, clearer than any of you. And if you can't see it too, then you're useless to me." Before anyone could react, Rook plunged the dagger into one of the recruits, silencing him with a swift, brutal strike. The others froze, their faces pale with shock. "Anyone else want to question me?" Rook growled, his bloodied dagger dripping onto the stone floor. The witch hunter's strike. The sound of the commotion carried far beyond the chapel, guiding Vren and his retinue to the Jackals' location. They moved quickly, surrounding the building and cutting off any possible escape. Inside, the Jackals were oblivious to the danger until it was too late. The first explosion shattered the chapel's front doors, and the witch hunters poured in, their torches illuminating the chaos within. "Sigmar!" Vren shouted, his sword alight with holy fire. The Jackals scrambled to defend themselves, but they were no match for the disciplined zeal of the witch hunters. One by one, they fell, their blood staining the chapel's stone floors. Risa fought desperately, hurling vials of wyrdstone-infused explosives at the attackers. The green smoke and fire created a temporary barrier, but it wouldn't hold for long. "Rook, we have to go," she shouted, but Rook was beyond reason. He stood at the altar, clutching a shard of wyrdstone in one hand and a vial of reflections in the other. "They won't take me," Rook muttered, his voice barely audible. "They can't take what I've become." Rook's final descent. As the witch hunters broke through the barriers, Rook turned to face them, his eyes glowing with the unholy light of wyrdstone. He inhaled the contents of the vial in his hand, the power coursing through him in a surge of energy and madness. "Tviad! You want me!" he roared, his voice echoing through the chapel. "Come and take me!" Rook charged at Vren, his dagger a blur of motion. The two clashed in a fury of steel and fire, but Rook's wyrdstone-fueled strength was no match for Vren's precision and discipline. With a final, decisive strike, Vren drove his sword through Rook's chest, the holy flames consuming the warband leader in a burst of light. As Rook fell, the remaining jackals scattered, their morale shattered. Risa was among them, slipping away into the shadows as the witch hunters secured the chapel. The end of the jackals. By dawn, the Veiled Jackals were no more. Those who hadn't been killed had fled into the depths of Mordheim, their fates uncertain. The witch hunters had won, but at a cost. The city's corruption had left its mark on them, and the horrors they had faced would haunt them forever. Vren stood over Rook's lifeless body, his sword still burning with holy fire. "Another heretic falls," he said quietly, "but the corruption remains." As the witch hunters left the ruined chapel, the green glow of wyrdstone lingered, a reminder that Mordheim's curse was far from broken. Chapter 19. The Witch Hunter's Judgment. The heart of Mordheim was a hellscape of twisted stone and wyrdstone corruption, its labyrinthine streets leading to a massive crater at the city's center, the place where the comet had fallen and birthed the city's curse. Green light pulsed from the crater, its malevolent energy warping the air and twisting the ruins into impossible shapes. Elias Vren stood at the edge of this abyss, his retinue of witch hunters behind him. Their torches flickered, casting long shadows against the warped walls. Vren's face was pale, his jaw tight as he stared into the heart of the city. He could feel the corruption pressing down on him, clawing at his resolve, but his grip on his sword remained steady. "This is where it ends," Vren said, his voice calm but resolute. "Kellen Rook has chosen his path. Sigmar's judgment will be delivered here." The witch hunters nodded silently, their faces grim. They knew the dangers of facing Rook in a place like this, but their faith in Sigmar and their captain gave them strength. Rook's transformation. Deeper in the ruins, Kellen Rook stood before a jagged altar made of wyrdstone shards. His once sharp features were gaunt, his skin pale and stretched taut over his bones. His eyes glowed with the sickly green light of corruption, and his breathing was labored but steady. In his hand he held a shard of Shards of the Veil, its crystalline surface shimmering with unholy energy. "This is it," Rook muttered to himself, his voice a rasp. "The power I need to break free, to become more." He turned the shard over in his hands, his mind a storm of rage and paranoia. The voices of betrayal still whispered in his ears, growing louder with every moment. Lask, Risa, even Dag, they had all turned on him, but he had survived. He would always survive. With a sudden motion, Rook inhaled the shard's crystalline dust, the power surging through him like fire. His body convulsed, his veins glowing green as the wyrdstone worked its foul magic. His muscles swelled, his skin cracked and twisted, and a guttural roar erupted from his throat as his humanity slipped away. When the transformation was complete, Rook stood as a monstrous figure, twice the size of a man, his body a grotesque fusion of flesh and wyrdstone. His glowing eyes burned with hatred, and his voice, now a deep, guttural growl, echoed through the ruins. "They think they can kill me," Rook snarled. "Let them come." The climax. Vren and his witch hunters reached the altar moments later, their torches casting flickering light on the abomination that Rook had become. The air around him crackled with energy, the wyrdstone in his body radiating a palpable heat. "Rook," Vren called, stepping forward. "You've lost everything, your warband, your humanity. Surrender, and Sigmar's light may yet grant you peace." Rook laughed, a horrible guttural sound. "Peace? There's no peace in this city, Vren. Only power, and I've taken it for myself." Vren raised his sword, its edge glowing with holy fire. Then you leave me no choice. With a cry of, "For Sigmar!" Vren charged, his sword blazing as he closed the distance between them. The other witch hunters followed, their weapons ready, but Rook was faster than they anticipated. With a swipe of his massive arm, Rook sent two of the witch hunters flying, their bodies slamming into the stone walls with sickening force. He roared, the wyrdstone in his veins surging as he lashed out with inhuman strength. Vren met Rook head-on, his blade cutting deep into the abomination's arm. Green ichor spilled from the wound, hissing as it hit the ground, but Rook barely flinched. He swung a clawed hand at Vren, who narrowly dodged, rolling to the side and slashing at Rook's legs. The other witch hunters pressed the attack, their hammers and swords glowing with the power of their faith. They struck at Rook from all sides, but his wyrdstone-infused body absorbed much of the punishment. He grabbed one attacker and hurled him into the crater, the man's scream fading as he disappeared into the green abyss. Vren's desperation. As the battle raged, it became clear that Rook's newfound strength was overwhelming. One by one, the witch hunters fell, leaving Vren alone against the monstrous figure. His breathing was labored, his armor dented and bloodied, but his resolve remained unbroken. "You can't win," Rook growled, advancing on Vren. "You're nothing but a pawn, a tool of a god who abandoned this city long ago." Vren gritted his teeth, raising his sword. "Sigmar's light shines even here, Rook, and it will burn you to ash." With a surge of strength, Vren charged again, his blade igniting with holy fire. He struck at Rook's chest, the blade sinking deep and unleashing a burst of radiant light. Rook roared in pain, his massive hands swinging down to swat Vren away, but the witch hunter rolled aside, narrowly avoiding the blow. "Your power is a lie," Vren shouted, his voice ringing through the ruins. "It will destroy you, just as it has destroyed everything else in this cursed city." The final blow. As Rook staggered, weakened by the holy fire coursing through his body, Vren saw his opportunity. He lunged forward, driving his blade into the center of Rook's chest, where the wyrdstone pulsed like a second heart. The explosion of light and energy that followed was blinding, a torrent of green and gold that consumed them both. When the light faded, Vren stood over the smoking remains of Kellen Rook, his sword still embedded in the abomination's chest. The monstrous figure had reverted to something resembling a man, his body twisted and broken, but no longer glowing with wyrdstone's unholy light. Vren pulled his sword free, his breathing heavy. He looked around the battlefield, taking in the bodies of his fallen comrades and the ruin of the city around him. Mordheim was still a place of chaos, but for now, one of its greatest threats had been extinguished. A hollow victory. As Vren limped away from the altar, the green glow of wyrdstone still pulsing faintly around him, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his losses. The Veiled Jackals were no more, but the city's corruption remained. The voices of his fallen comrades echoed in his mind, and for a brief moment Vren wondered if Mordheim had taken something from him as well. But he pushed the thought aside. The battle was won, and Sigmar's judgment had been delivered. That was all that mattered. Chapter 20. Ashes of Ambition. The fires of purification raged in the heart of Mordheim. Green-tinged smoke billowed into the corrupted sky as the witch hunters piled the last of the Veiled Jackals' wyrdstone shards into the blaze. The crackling flames hissed and popped, consuming the cursed stone with a violent energy that sent flickers of unnatural light across the ruins. Elias Vren stood at the edge of the pyre, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. His gaunt features were illuminated by the flickering fire, and his bloodshot eyes reflected both exhaustion and grim satisfaction. Around him, the remnants of his retinue worked tirelessly to complete the purge, their torches lighting up the twisted landscape of the accursed city. "The last of it," said Captain Adalric Toth, his voice hoarse. He gestured to the charred remnants of the Jackal's cache, now reduced to little more than ash. "Every shard we found, burned." Vren nodded slowly. Every shard we could find, he corrected. There's more. Buried deep in this city. There always is. The final purge. The witch hunters combed through the ruined watchtower that had served as the Jackals' final stronghold, ensuring no trace of Wyrdstone remained. Bodies of the fallen Jackals were thrown into the flames, their corrupted forms burned to ash alongside the stone they had sacrificed everything for. Risa Greel's laboratory was among the most damning finds. Her alchemical experiments, intricate and grotesque in equal measure, revealed the depths to which the Jackals had gone in their pursuit of power. Vials of reflections, unstable mixtures of shards of the veil, and crude notes on refining wyrdstone into ever more potent forms lay scattered across the room. The sight turned Vren's stomach. She was a monster, Toth said, standing beside him. Oh, Vren replied, his voice heavy. She was a victim. Mordheim breeds desperation, and desperation breeds monsters. She was consumed, like the rest of them. Vren's reflection, as the flames consumed the last remnants of the Veiled Jackals. Vren stepped away from the pyre. He found himself standing at the edge of the great crater, staring down into the abyss where the comet had fallen so many years ago. The wyrdstone glow was strongest here, pulsing like a sickly heartbeat. Mordheim's corruption was palpable, pressing down on him like a weight he could never escape. Even after purging the Jackals, the city's taint remained. The ruins seemed alive, whispering to him in a voice he couldn't quite hear. This city doesn't end, Toth said, stepping beside him. You could burn every shard, kill every heretic, and it would still stand. Vren didn't reply immediately. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword as he stared into the swirling green light. It's not the city that corrupts, Adalric. It's the people. Mordheim is just a mirror. It shows us what we already are. Greedy, desperate, willing to destroy ourselves for a chance at power. Then what's the point? Toad asked, his voice low. Why fight at all if we can't win? Vren turned to him, his eyes cold but resolute. Because we must. Even if we only hold back the darkness for a moment, it's a moment where the light shines brighter. That's enough. The endless cycle. As dawn broke over Mordheim's cursed skyline, the witch hunters prepared to leave. Their mission was complete, or as complete as any mission could be in a place like this. Vren mounted his horse, his expression unreadable as he cast one final glance at the ruined city. Behind him, the green glow of the wyrdstone crater pulsed faintly, a reminder that Mordheim's curse was far from broken. The city would endure, as it always had, drawing new souls to its poisoned embrace. A new Orban. In the shadows of the city's outskirts, a small group of scavengers crept toward the ruins. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes alight with hunger, not for food, but for fortune. Among them was a tall, lean figure who carried a crude map marked with notes about the city's richest wyrdstone deposits. This is it, the leader said, his voice low and eager. Mordheim, the city of the damned. Everything we've ever wanted is in there. And everything we've ever feared, one of his followers muttered, clutching a rusted weapon. The leader grinned, stepping forward. Fear is the price of ambition. Now, let's get to work. As the new warband disappeared into the shadows of Mordheim, the cycle began anew. The city's curse was eternal, and so too was the greed and corruption it fed upon. Elias Vren rode away from Mordheim, but in his heart he knew he would return. Mordheim's story was never truly over. The city waited, its ruins hungry for the next fool to seek its poisoned treasures.